Have you ever looked up at the night sky and felt a strange sense of connection, as if the stars were whispering a story just for you? We're about to embark on one of those stories, a tale not just of constellations, but of the hands that carved them. Before we begin this journey into the myth of the Star Forgers, we'd love to know where in the world you're joining us from tonight, and what hour graces your sky. Let us know in the comments below. It's a wonderful thought that we're all looking up at the same tapestry of myths, even if our view is a little different. Tonight, we explore a legend born from that very tapestry, the story of how the heavens were carved by forgotten hands. It begins not with a god or a king, but with a young apprentice named Lyra, whose ambition was as vast as the void itself. In the silent halls of the Star Forgers, a sacred rule was law. The Valacirca Forge was to remain dormant, its power too volatile, its purpose lost to time. The elders preached caution, fearing the echo of ancient catastrophes. But Lyra saw what they refused to acknowledge: a constellation, Serpentarius, was fading, its light dying star by star. And in the heart of a young woman desperate to prove her worth, that silent decay was a call to action she could not ignore. So, with a resolve that belied her trembling hands, she defied the decree. In the deep solitude of the mountain's heart, she stood before the dormant Valacirca Forge, an anvil of pure cosmic ore that had not tasted starlight for generations. As she reached out, the air itself hummed with anticipation. Then she touched it, and the world erupted. Raw, untamed starlight surged from her fingertips into the ancient anvil, a river of liquid brilliance that illuminated forgotten runes and shook the very foundations of the mountain. This was not the gentle craft of her teachers. This was a primal scream of creation, a desperate attempt to mend a broken piece of the sky. But that shimmering light, so beautiful and so dangerous, called to more than just the stars. It was a beacon, and in the distant, watchful silence of the cosmos, something ancient and vigilant began to stir. The heavens, it seemed, were not as empty as they appeared. For a heart-stopping moment, the forge resisted her. The initial surge of power was a wild beast, bucking and writhing against her will, threatening to shatter the ancient anvil and take the mountain with it. Lyra's arms trembled with the effort, her teeth clenched as she poured every ounce of her focus, her very spirit, into the task of calming the storm she had unleashed. It was a battle of pure intention against raw, chaotic energy. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the tumult ceased. The light flowing from her hands softened from a blinding torrent into a steady, manageable stream. She had done it. She had stabilized the forge, but her victory came with an instant and permanent cost. As the energy settled, a searing heat blossomed in her palm. She gasped, pulling her hand back to see a symbol etched into her skin, glowing with the same soft, unearthly light as the forge itself. It was not a burn or a scar. It was a sigil, a mark of ownership. The Valacirca Forge had accepted her, but in doing so, it had branded her. This was no minor transgression she could hide or explain away. This luminous brand was a beacon, shining its truth into the night, and it was seen immediately. High above, in his isolated observatory, Master Orrin felt the disturbance in the celestial currents. He turned his weathered face from his telescope, his old eyes narrowing as he saw the familiar, forbidden light emanating from the sealed forge chamber. And then he saw it, a new, smaller point of light on the mountain itself, a signature he knew could only belong to the one who had dared this folly. Disapproval hardened into cold, grim certainty. His most promising and most reckless apprentice had crossed a line from which there was no return. Down in the forge, Lyra stared at the mark, her heart pounding not with pride, but with panic. The choice was upon her, stark and immediate. She could shut it all down now. She could try to smother the sigil, run to the elders and beg for forgiveness before the evidence was undeniable. It might mean exile, but she would be alive, or she could press on. As she hesitated, a vision flashed behind her eyes, more vivid than any dream. The constellation Serpentarius, the serpent bearer, was not just fading, it was actively crumbling, its stars winking out one by one into a terrible, final darkness. The silence of that void was a scream more piercing than the forge's initial roar. In that moment, her own safety became irrelevant. The sky's need was a weight far heavier than the elder's wrath. Clenching her marked hand into a fist, she turned back to the anvil. She would continue. The stakes were no longer about punishment. They were about survival. Her own, and that of the heavens themselves. She reached for the first failing star in the pattern, a tiny, flickering ember in the great serpent's tail. With a gentle push of the forge's energy, she felt it catch, its light swelling from a dim flicker to a steady, brilliant gleam. It was a small victory, a single point of light saved. But as that star flared with renewed life, its light acted as a silent alarm, a shout in the quiet of the cosmos, and from the depths of a nearby nebula, a shadow that was not a shadow detached itself, turning with deliberate, ancient purpose. It began a swift, silent descent towards the source of the disturbance, moving with an intent that was as cold and inevitable as the turning of the galaxy. The figure that landed before the forge entrance was unlike anything Lyra had ever seen, a being woven from solidified starlight and geometry. This was Kalin, a celestial guardian, and his very presence altered the space around him. He did not walk so much as glide, his crystalline form casting intricate, shifting patterns of rainbow light onto the stone walls, as if the air itself were being questioned and found wanting. A deep, instinctual fear told Lyra to flee, to use the minor teleportation spells every apprentice learned. But when she tried to focus her will, she found the energy around her had become thick, unyielding. Kalin's arrival had not just blocked the entrance, it had neutralized the very possibility of escape, creating a cage of silent, oppressive power. She was trapped, with no choice but to face the consequences of her actions directly. Yet, when the being spoke, his voice was not the thunderous judgment she expected. It was a melody of chimes and deep resonance, and it carried a profound, weary sorrow. "Little Ember," the voice echoed in her mind, "why do you grasp at a fire that consumes the hand that holds it?" He explained the elder's deepest, most terrifying secret, the true reason the Valacirca Forge was sealed. Its power was not a tool to be wielded, but a symbiotic bond. Every star mended, every constellation repaired, came at a direct cost, the life force of the forger. The energy did not simply flow through them, it was drawn from them. The brilliance she channeled to heal the stars was a piece of her own vitality, siphoned away into the void. Her act of creation was, in its essence, an act of slow, deliberate self-sacrifice. Lyra's mind reeled. This changed everything. Her defiance was not just breaking a rule, it was signing her own death warrant with every flicker of light she restored. The conflict within her was no longer a simple choice between right and wrong, but a desperate weighing of truths. Should she believe this sorrowful stranger, this creature of light who spoke of a terrible cost? Or should she trust the undeniable pull she felt from the forge, the deep, instinctual certainty that had guided her hand? That feeling insisted this was her purpose, that the fading sky needed her, cost or no cost. Her ambition to prove her worth now seemed childish and naive, replaced by the horrifying gravity of a genuine sacrifice. The stakes of her quest had just escalated beyond anything she could have imagined. It was no longer about potential exile or the disapproval of her masters. The price of success was now measured in breaths and heartbeats. Each star saved would weaken her, bringing her closer to a final, silent extinguishing. This was the true burden of the Star Forgers, the knowledge that had led the elders to choose preservation over creation, to let pieces of the sky die rather than spend their own lives to save them. Faced with this devastating truth, Lyra looked from the Guardian's luminous form to the faint, dying light of Serpentarius in the sky beyond the entrance. Abandoning her quest meant safety. A long life lived in the shadow of her failure. Continuing meant embracing a path that led to an early end. In that agonizing silence, her decision crystallized not from recklessness, but from a newfound, sober resolve. The sky was worth the cost. To prove her commitment, not to the Guardian or the Elders, but to herself and the heavens, she slowly turned her back on Kalin. Ignoring the terrifying revelation, she stepped forward and placed her marked hand firmly back upon the cold surface of the anvil. This time, the forge did not respond with a blinding flash of light. Instead, a deep, resonant hum emanated from the very heart of the mountain, a vibration so powerful it shook the ground beneath her feet and sent fine dust cascading from the ceiling. The mountain itself was awakening. That deep, resonant hum was not just a sound, it was a command. The mountain, an entity of stone and ancient magic, heard the call of its awakened heart. The very walls of the forge chamber began to groan and shift, stone grinding against stone in a symphony of raw power. From the floor, massive pillars erupted upward, not randomly, but with a deliberate architectural intelligence. They curved and intertwined, weaving themselves into a formidable barrier between Lyra and the chamber's entrance, sealing her inside with the anvil. For a moment, she saw Kalin's luminous form through the closing gaps, his expression one of startled surprise rather than anger, before the stone veil closed completely, plunging her into a silence broken only by the forge's steady pulse. She was safe for now, but the price of that safety was immediate and terrifying. The seismic shockwave from the mountain's awakening rippled outwards, and from deep within the cavernous library levels below, she heard the sickening crash of collapsing shelves and the shatter of crystalline star charts that had stood for millennia. The mountain was protecting its core, but in doing so, it was threatening to destroy the very knowledge that gave the Star Forgers their purpose. Lyra's initial instinct was to panic, to search for a crack in the new stone cage, or to try and reverse the process. But as the dust settled, both literally and figuratively, A cold clarity washed over her. This was not a reprieve, it was a timer. The mountain had granted her a moment, but it was a fleeting one. Kalin would not be held back for long, and the geological upheaval could easily turn this chamber into her tomb if the mountain's structure became too unstable. She was in a race against the very ground beneath her feet. Fleeing was impossible. Her only path forward was to succeed, and to do it with a speed and efficiency she had never before possessed. Her eyes, desperate for a solution, darted around the chamber and landed on the one thing that had not been obscured by the rising stone, a vast, intricate map of the heavens that glowed with its own soft light on the far wall. It was a masterwork, far more detailed than any she had studied in the libraries below. This was not a simple chart of stars. It was a dynamic representation of the celestial currents. She rushed to it, her marked hand almost tingling in its presence. This was her respite, her only chance. Instead of wasting the precious seconds on fear, she poured all of her focus into the map. She traced the lines of Serpentarius, seeing its weakness not as a simple break, but as a disconnect in a larger flow of energy. The stakes had transformed once again. It was no longer just a question of saving a constellation or sacrificing her life. It was a desperate puzzle. Success meant she might still save a piece of the sky and perhaps find a way out of this self-made prison. Failure no longer meant mere exile or a slow fading. It meant being buried alive, entombed forever with the magnificent, deadly power she had been so desperate to command. The weight of the mountain seemed to press down on her, a tangible reminder that her ambition now literally held the roof over her head. Every second spent studying was a second borrowed from the crumbling integrity of the archives and the patience of the celestial guardian just beyond the stone. Her breath caught in her throat as her gaze, scanning for a solution, locked onto the central pattern of the great map. It was a design she had never noticed in her simpler studies. It didn't show constellations as pictures, but as a complex, interlocking system of gears and cogs, like the inner workings of an impossibly vast, celestial clock. And in that moment, a new and staggering understanding dawned, rewriting everything she thought she knew about the sky. The intricate dance of gears and sprockets on the map wasn't just a diagram, it was a revelation. The constellations were not isolated pictures painted on a dark canvas. They were cogs in a cosmic engine, each one interlocked with its neighbors, transferring energy and maintaining a balance so delicate that a single misstep could unravel the entire mechanism. Serpentarius wasn't just broken, it was a seized gear, and her previous attempt to force it back to life with a surge of power was like trying to fix a watch with a hammer. The violent flare of light from the first star she mended wasn't a sign of success. It was a scream of protest from the machinery, a jolt that had sent destructive shock waves through the celestial clockwork, and by extension, into the mountain that was symbiotically linked to it. The very resonance that was threatening to bury her alive was a direct consequence of her own brute force approach. This new understanding demanded an entirely different skill set. Defiance and raw power were useless here. What was required was the patience of a master watchmaker and the delicate touch of a surgeon. Her internal conflict transformed in an instant. The battle was no longer against the elders or even the guardian outside her stone prison. It was a battle within herself, a struggle to quiet her ambition and replace it with a profound, focused precision. She had to learn the rhythm of the heavens, to listen for the subtle clicks and whirs that indicated a healthy connection. A single misalignment, a fraction of a degree off in her application of energy, wouldn't just fail to fix Serpentarius. It could send a ripple of dysfunction through the interconnected gears, potentially stalling the constellation next to it, or the one beyond that, triggering a cascade of darkness across the sky. The stakes had just escalated from a local repair job to a potential universal catastrophe. The responsibility was paralyzing. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Lyra made a conscious decision to trust the map and this new, terrifyingly intricate method. She closed her eyes, not to block out the world, but to see with a different sense. She placed her marked hand back on the anvil, but this time, she did not push. Instead, she asked. She sent a whisper of inquiry through the forge, a gentle probe aimed not at the dying star itself, but at the celestial gears surrounding it. She felt the resistance immediately, a grinding stiffness in the cosmic machinery where there should have been smooth rotation. The problem wasn't the central star, it was the transfer of energy through the constellations pattern. With painstaking slowness, she channeled a thread of the forge's energy, finer than a spider's silk, into the points of connection. It was an act of lubrication, of gentle coaxing, not a forceful shove. She wasn't trying to reignite a flame, she was unsticking a seized pivot. The effect was immediate, but profoundly different. There was no blinding flash, no earth-shaking roar. The destructive resonance shaking the mountains ceased, replaced by a deep, satisfying hum of proper alignment. On the map before her, the gear representing Serpentarius gave a slow, hesitant turn, then another, gaining smoothness with each rotation. The faint star in the serpent's tail, which she had previously forced into a bright flare, now began to glow with a steady, healthy light, its brilliance increasing not in a violent burst, but in a gradual, natural brightening as the energy flow was restored. It was working. The quieter, more intelligent approach was actually healing the sky, and in doing so, it had saved her from being crushed. The stone pillars that had sealed her in responded to the newfound stability. With a low rumble, they began to retract, sinking back into the floor as smoothly as they had risen. The barrier was gone, and there, standing exactly where he had been, was Kalin. But the Guardian's posture had completely changed. The aggressive, interrogative stance was gone. His crystalline form was still, his head tilted slightly, and the light that pulsed within him was not the harsh glare of an enforcer, but the soft, curious glow of an observer who has just witnessed something unexpected and deeply intriguing. The chamber was filled with a new kind of silence, no longer charged with threat, but with a profound, unspoken question. Kalin did not advance with the deliberate, weighty steps of an executioner. Instead, he drifted forward, his movement as fluid and silent as a shift in the atmosphere. The brilliant, healthy light from the now stable Serpentarius constellation played across his crystalline form, fracturing into 1,000 gentle rainbows that danced over the stone walls. He was no longer a barrier between Lyra and her destiny, but a part of the landscape she had just healed. His gesture was simple, yet it carried the weight of ages. He did not reach for her, nor did he make a move towards the anvil to shut it down. Instead, one luminous, geometric hand rose and extended a single, sharp finger. pointing past her to a different, far more intricate section of the glowing star map. It was a region of the sky she had only ever seen as a dense, confusing knot of light, a place the elders called the Unreadable core. He was not stopping her work, he was redirecting it, suggesting that her true task had only just begun. In that silent gesture, an alliance was born, not from words or promises, but from a shared recognition of a greater problem. The dynamic between them shifted irrevocably. Kalin was shedding his role as a warden, the enforcer of a forgotten law. The subtle, intelligent method Lyra had just demonstrated had proven she was not merely a reckless child playing with fire. She was a potential student, one who might actually be capable of understanding the magnitude of what was at stake. He was transforming into a guide, a keeper of secrets so old that the Star Forgers themselves had relegated them to myth. The immediate conflict of defiance versus enforcement melted away, but it was instantly replaced by a new, more insidious tension, the tension of trust. Lyra's mind raced, a storm of doubt and hope. Could she truly rely on this ancient being, a creature whose motives were as alien as the void from which he came? Was this guidance genuine, or merely a more sophisticated form of control? Perhaps he had his own agenda, a purpose that required a mortal tool to accomplish, and she was simply the most convenient instrument at hand. To follow him was to step off the map of everything she knew, into a realm of cosmic politics and ancient debts she could not possibly comprehend. Lyra stood at a crossroads more profound than any she had faced before. Her solitary path, driven by defiant ambition, had brought her to the brink of destruction, and then, through a flash of insight, to a fragile success. But staring at the impossibly complex web of gears Kalin was now indicating, she understood with a crushing certainty that her lone journey was over. She simply did not possess the knowledge to navigate what came next. To proceed alone would be arrogance of the highest order, a guarantee of failure on a scale that would make the crumbling of a single constellation seem trivial. The choice was stark: retreat into the familiar, limited world of the mountain and its prohibitions, or take a leap of faith into the unknown, placing her trust in a being who had, moments ago, been ready to contain her. She looked from the Guardian's inscrutable, luminous face to the intricate, failing machinery of the cosmos on the map. The sky needed more than just her courage. It needed wisdom she did not have. With a slow, deliberate nod, she made her decision. She would accept his guidance. It was a surrender of her ego, an admission that her solitary path was insufficient, but it was also the first truly wise choice she had made. The stakes of their endeavor evolved in that moment, escalating from the deeply personal to the universally monumental. It was no longer just about Lyra's survival, or even the salvation of a single constellation. They were now entering a partnership, a fragile collaboration between mortal ingenuity and celestial knowledge. The potential for success was breathtaking. Together, they might accomplish what neither could alone, restoring a balance lost for eons. But the risk of failure was now infinitely more terrifying. If her trust was misplaced, if Kalin's guidance was a deception, the consequences would be a betrayal so profound it could unravel the very fabric of reality. She was no longer just betting her life. She was gambling with the fate of the heavens themselves. The weight of that partnership settled on her shoulders, a burden far heavier than the mountain above them. Kalin, sensing her acceptance, moved closer. His voice, when it came, was a soft chime that seemed to resonate directly in her soul. "The gear you have mended is but a small tooth on a wheel larger than your world," he intoned. "But the mainspring of the great clock, the source from which all motion flows, is the Nexus constellation, and it is failing. Its rhythms are growing slow and erratic. Should its heart stop beating," he paused, the silence itself conveying the unimaginable consequence. "The time itself will cease to flow." With their fragile alliance formed, Lyra and Kalin did not travel by ship or spell. Instead, they stood together before the great anvil, and in a silent, mutual agreement, they allowed their awareness to detach from their physical forms and ascend. It was like riding a beam of starlight itself, their consciousnesses flowing upwards, leaving the solidity of the mountain far below as they hurtled into the deep velvet of space. They passed familiar constellations, but these were now seen not as pictures, but as the interlocking gears Kalin had shown her, humming with energy. They traveled further than any star forger had ever dared, into a region of the cosmos that was less a place and more a concept, the very engine room of reality. And there, they found the heart of the problem. The Nexus constellation was not a shape one could easily draw. It was a dense, brilliant knot of 7 pulsars, stars so dense and perfectly aligned that they beat in a rhythm that should have been as constant as a metronome, the fundamental pulse that kept the celestial clockwork ticking. But what Lyra and Kalin witnessed was not a steady beat. It was a death rattle. The pulsars were stuttering, their light flaring and dimming in a sickly or rhythmic pattern. One would blaze with frantic, desperate energy, while its neighbor would flicker so weakly it was almost invisible. The rhythm was not just slow, it was broken, a symphony falling into dissonant chaos. The consequences of this failure were immediately, horrifyingly apparent in the space surrounding the Nexus. It was as if they were looking at a pond into which a dying stone had been dropped. Waves of distorted time rippled outwards from the faltering heart. In one ripple, Lyra's consciousness brushed against a star system where she witnessed an entire planet's civilization rise, build glittering cities, and crumble to dust in the span of a single, dizzying heartbeat. Life bloomed and withered in a frantic blur. In the very next ripple, another system was trapped in a single, frozen moment. A comet hung mid-flight, its tail a motionless brushstroke of ice. A nebula's beautiful, swirling gases were suspended like glass, unable to expand or contract. The cosmos around the Nexus was suffering from a terrible sickness, a temporal plague where moments were either racing towards oblivion or had been strangled into absolute stillness. The scale of the devastation was so vast, so fundamentally wrong, that it threatened to overwhelm Lyra's mind. How could anything, even the Valacirca Forge, hope to fix a wound in time itself? The conflict that arose then was not with an external enemy, but with the crushing weight of insignificance. The problem was so immense it felt like trying to bail out an ocean with a thimble. Lyra felt the full force of her mortality, a fleeting spark, contemplating the repair of an eternal flame. Even the mighty hum of the forge, which had felt so powerful within the mountain, now seemed like a whisper against the roaring silence of a dying universe. Doubt, cold and sharp, pierced her resolve. Could the forge even generate enough power to jump-start a cosmic heart? Or would attempting it simply drain its energy completely, snuffing out their only hope? and leaving the cosmos to its fate. She felt Kalin's presence beside her, a steady anchor of light in the chaotic void, but even he radiated a profound solemnity. He had known the truth of this, had tried to warn her of scales she could not comprehend. The tension was a palpable force, the silence between them filled with the unspoken question, was this the end? But as Lyra watched a star system age to dust before her eyes, something hardened within her. The sight of such profound, unnatural loss ignited a defiance far greater than her youthful ambition. She turned her awareness towards Kalin, pouring all her conviction into the thought she projected to him. This was not a time for doubt. The Valacirca Forge was not merely a tool, it was a relic from the age of the Titans, the very beings who had engineered this celestial clock. It was not designed for simple repairs. It was built for this exact, catastrophic purpose, to be the emergency spark, the universal reboot button for when the system faced total failure. Its power was not meant to be used lightly, but it was meant to be used. To leave it dormant in the mountain, while reality unraveled, was the greatest transgression of all. Her decision was absolute. She would commit to the attempt. There was no other choice. In that moment, the stakes of their story transcended everything that had come before. This was no longer about a single apprentice's rebellion or the salvation of one constellation. The conflict had escalated to a truly cosmic level. They were no longer just fixing the heavens. They were fighting for the integrity of cause and effect, for the very flow of time that allowed stories to be told, lives to be lived, and stars to be born. The price of failure was no longer personal exile or even death. It was the end of sequence, the cessation of history, a universe trapped in an eternal, broken moment, or racing towards a simultaneous, silent extinction. The responsibility was so immense, it was almost a physical pressure. Yet, with Lyra's commitment made, a path forward emerged, fraught with its own perils. Kalin's thought echoed back to her, calm but dire. To channel the Forge's full, unimaginable power across such a vast distance and into the heart of the Nexus would require a focusing lens of immense potency, a conduit that they did not possess. The Valacirca Forge was incomplete. Its keystone, the artifact that would allow it to operate at such a scale, had been removed and hidden away when the Forge was originally sealed, lost to the ages for fear of its power being misused. Their impossible task now had a prerequisite. Before they could even think of saving time, they would have to find a key that had been forgotten by the world. Their descent into the mountain's roots felt less like a journey and more like a voyage backwards through time. The grand, well-trodden staircases of the Star Forgers gave way to rough-hewn tunnels, where the air grew cold and still, smelling of ancient dust and petrified stone. They were leaving behind the world of maps and known paths, entering the unmapped libraries, a place spoken of only in whispers by the elders. Here, the walls themselves were the archives, carved with celestial charts, so old the constellations they depicted had long since shifted into new patterns. Their only guide was the fragmented poetry of the first Star Forgers, verses passed down as ritual, but whose literal meaning had been lost to legend. Kalin, with his ageless memory, became their translator, his soft, chiming voice giving form to the cryptic clues. Seek the eye of the stone serpent, where the river of light runs dry. He would murmur, and Lyra would scan the caverns until she found a fossilized flow of obsidian that ended beneath a carving of a serpent's head. its single eye, a vacant niche pointing the way forward. Each solved riddle was a step deeper into the silent heart of the mountain's history. The journey was not just a physical one, it was a revelation. In a vast, cavernous chamber, they discovered a series of murals that took Lyra's breath away. They were not carved by the hands of any star forger she recognized. The figures depicted were titans, beings of such immense scale and power that they held stars in their palms like marbles. The murals told a story of creation. These titans had engineered the celestial clockwork, building the great mechanism of the heavens with tools of pure energy. And the Valacirca Forge was not their greatest achievement, but their most essential tool, a portable heart they used to ignite and tune the stars themselves. The final mural showed the titans not in a blaze of glory, but in a quiet, solemn retreat, walking single file into the deep void, leaving their forge and their mountain behind. They had not been destroyed, they had simply finished their work and moved on, entrusting its maintenance to others. This knowledge reshaped Lyra's entire understanding. She was not wielding a dangerous, forgotten power. She was attempting to operate a piece of machinery left by the original architects of reality. The weight of that legacy was both humbling and terrifying. But they were not welcome visitors in this sacred tomb. As they moved through the shadowy archives, they realized they were not alone. The air would occasionally shimmer, and a form would coalesce from the gloom, an ethereal echo of the Titans. These were not conscious beings, but residual energy, mindless guardians imprinted with a single command: protect. They drifted through the halls like silent, luminescent ghosts, their forms flickering with the same starlight that powered the forge. The tension became a constant, gnawing presence. Every corner turned could reveal a guardian, and a direct confrontation was unthinkable. The sheer power radiating from even the smallest echo was enough to make the stone walls vibrate. They were mice tiptoeing through a hall of sleeping giants, where a single misplaced breath could bring catastrophic attention. Lyra knew they could not fight, and hiding was impossible in the open, echoing chambers. Her only option was a desperate, ingenious deception. Drawing upon the bond forged by the sigil on her palm, she reached into the Valacirca Forge's core energy, not to draw power out, but to mimic its source. She focused, imagining the Titan's signature, the unique frequency of creation that had built these very halls. It was like trying to hum a song she had only heard once, a distant, complex melody. The effort was immense. A cold sweat broke out on her brow, and a sharp, draining ache spread from the mark on her hand up through her arm, as if her very lifeblood was being used as fuel for the illusion. But it worked. A faint, resonant field enveloped them, a shroud that made them smell, for lack of a better word, like family to the echoes. The patrolling guardians would pause, their luminous heads tilting as if listening to a familiar tune, and then drift past them with indifference. Each successful pass was a victory, but each one left Lyra paler, her steps a little less steady. The stakes of their quest had now become intimately personal and agonizingly immediate. The race was no longer just against the failing Nexus or the patience of the cosmos. It was a race against Lyra's own fading strength. The personal cost of her power, which Kalin had warned her about, was no longer an abstract concept. It was a tangible drain she felt with every heartbeat. Each use of the Forge's energy to maintain the shroud was another minute, shaved off the time she had left. Another drop in a well that was not bottomless. The search for the keystone was transformed into a grim countdown. Would they find it before she was too weak to continue? The grand, cosmic mission now hinged on the endurance of one young woman, her body becoming the hourglass for the universe itself. Pushing through the fatigue, her vision swimming at the edges, Lyra followed Kalin's guidance to the end of a long, descending corridor. The tunnel opened into a circular chamber, utterly unlike the rough-hewn caves they had traversed. The walls were smooth, polished to a mirror finish, and in the center, resting on a pedestal of pure crystal, pulsed the keystone, a perfect, self-contained orb of swirling nebula, glowing with a soft, inviting light. But between them and their prize stood the final guardian. This was no drifting echo. It was a sentinel of concentrated starlight, a silent, humanoid figure of such intense brilliance that it was difficult to look upon directly. It did not patrol, it simply was an unmovable obstacle and the final test of their worthiness. The Sentinel of Light did not advance. It did not raise a weapon or unleash a roar of cosmic energy. Instead, it extended an arm, and from its brilliant palm, a wave of pure information washed over Lyra, not as words, but as a direct understanding implanted in her mind. This was not a battle to be fought with force. It was a trial to be passed with intent. The being projected a challenge into the silent chamber. She must prove her worth not by mending what was broken, but by bringing something entirely new into existence. She was to use the Valacirca Forge's power to create a new, minor star pattern from nothing, a signature in the sky that had never existed before. This was the true test of a star forger, the ultimate measure of their heart. Success would mean the Sentinel would recognize her as a true heir to the Titan's legacy and grant her the keystone. Failure, however, carried a final and absolute consequence. If her creation was flawed, if her intent was impure, the Sentinel would not destroy her. It would absorb her, along with every spark of the Forge's energy she wielded, pulling it all back into the mountain's core, erasing her transgression and returning the Forge to its eternal slumber. She would become a forgotten footnote in the mountain's memory, a cautionary tale absorbed by the very stone. The tension in the chamber became a physical weight, so heavy Lyra felt she could barely draw breath. This was the moment of truth, stripped of all pretense. There were no more tricks to play, no echoes to deceive, no mountain defenses to hide behind. It was just her, the anvil, and the judgment of a being that had witnessed the birth of galaxies. Every lesson, every moment of doubt, every sacrifice led to this single, defining act. There was no room for error, no second chance. The conflict was entirely internal now, a frantic sorting of her own soul. What was her true motivation? Was it the defiant pride of an apprentice, proving her elders wrong, the desperate need for glory and recognition? Or was it something purer, the selfless desire to heal the aching silence of the decaying sky that had called to her from the beginning? The Sentinel would not be fooled by a skillful imitation of creation. It would peer directly into the heart of the act itself. The stakes could not be higher. The fate of the Nexus, the flow of time, the very cosmos she hoped to save, all of it now rested on the purity of her purpose in this one fleeting moment. Exhausted, her body trembling from the sustained drain of power, Lyra turned her back on the brilliant Sentinel and faced the anvil. She closed her eyes, blocking out the fear, the pressure, the immense scale of what depended on her success. She searched within herself, past the ambition, past the fear of failure, past the desire to be remembered. She searched for the feeling that had first drawn her to the stars as a child, a feeling not of power, but of wonder. She found it a quiet, persistent hope for renewal, for second chances, for the beautiful, fragile cycle of life that even now was threatened by the stuttering heart of the universe. This was the feeling she needed. This was the seed of creation. When she opened her eyes and placed her marked hand upon the anvil, she did not channel a torrent of energy. She offered a whisper, a gentle invitation. She asked the forge to help her give form to that feeling. What emerged from the anvil was not a blazing sun or a complex, warrior-like constellation. It was a soft, gentle light that wove itself into the space above the anvil, forming the delicate, intricate shape of a butterfly. Its wings were nebulae of faint, shimmering blue and gold, and it seemed to flutter with a life of its own, a tiny, brand new rhythm in the great silence. There was no arrogance in its creation, no boastful display of power. It was a gesture of profound humility, an offering of beauty for its own sake. In every curve of its luminous wings, Lyra had poured not her ambition for glory, but her hope for renewal. The same hope that a caterpillar holds in its chrysalis, the belief that something new and beautiful can always emerge from an ending. She had created a symbol of transformation, a promise that decay was not the final state of things. The act cost her dearly. She felt a profound weakness settle into her bones, as if she had given a piece of her own hope to make it real. But as the finished constellation hung in the air, glowing with a soft, sincere light, she knew it was the truest thing she had ever done. For a long moment, the Sentinel was motionless, its brilliant light focused entirely on the tiny, fluttering butterfly. The entire chamber seemed to hold its breath. Then, the Sentinel's rigid posture relaxed. It gave a slow, deep nod, a gesture of ancient and profound respect. Its purpose fulfilled, its judgment passed. The being of concentrated starlight did not vanish in an explosion. It simply began to dissipate, its form unraveling into a shower of harmless, glittering motes that rose upwards like a reverse snowfall, returning to the mountain from which it came. The trial was over. She had passed. In the space where the Sentinel had stood, the keystone now floated, untethered. It was a pulsating orb of condensed nebula, swirling with galaxies of violet, deep blue, and silver. It drifted gently towards Lyra, as if drawn by the sigil on her palm. With a hand that shook from exhaustion and awe, she reached out, her fingers closing around the cool, smooth surface of the artifact. The moment she made contact, a new connection snapped into place, not just with the forge, but with the very architecture of the heavens. The moment her fingers made contact with the cool, smooth surface of the keystone, the world vanished. It was not a gentle merging, but an instantaneous, violent flood. The sigil on her palm, which had until now glowed with a light that was her own, erupted into a sunburst of pure, white-hot information. It was not simply knowledge that poured into her mind. It was the lived experience of the Titans themselves, the architects of reality. She saw galaxies spun into being not as a slow cosmic process, but as a deliberate act of will. She felt the weight of a black hole in the palm of a hand, larger than a solar system. She heard the silent, mathematical music that governed the spin of every electron, and the orbit of every planet. A symphony she could now, terrifyingly, almost comprehend. Eons of observation, creation, and a profound, weary love for the delicate clockwork they had built crashed into her consciousness, like an ocean into a thimble. Her own memories, the smell of the mountain herbs, the stern face of Master Orrin, her simple desire to fix a single broken star, were suddenly like faint, distant whispers against a roaring hurricane of cosmic history. Her identity, the very essence of what made her Lyra, was being scoured away by the sheer scale of what she now contained. Within this deluge, one fundamental truth crystallized with the force of a supernova. The Valacirca Forge was not a machine. It was not a tool to be picked up and used. The anvil, the chambers, the very mountain were merely a physical shell, a focusing lens for a consciousness that was as ancient as the first light. The forge was a living entity, a slumbering sentience that had waited, patient and silent, for a master worthy of the bond. It had not been sealed out of fear of its power, but out of fear of its choice. The elders had treated it as a dangerous weapon to be locked away, but it was a partner that demanded a sacrifice not of life, but of self. It had tested her, not with the Sentinel, but with every step she had taken. It had tested her defiance, her compassion with the parasite, her wisdom in understanding the clockwork, and finally, the purity of her heart in creating the butterfly. And she had passed. The bond was not one of control, but of symbiosis. She was not its wielder. She was its voice, its hands in a world the Titans had left behind. The conflict that erupted within her was the most desperate battle she had ever faced, and it was fought on the terrain of her own soul. The Titans' memories were not passive recordings. They were vibrant, compelling realities. She felt the urge to reshape a nebula simply because its current form displeased her new, ancient sensibilities. The simple, mortal concerns of a single world seemed trivial, insignificant specks in an infinite tapestry. Why struggle to save a flow of time that was, in the grand view, merely one possible rhythm among countless others? The allure of surrendering to this vast perspective was immense. It promised an end to fear, to pain, to the gnawing uncertainty of her mortal condition. She could become something more, something eternal, but to do so would be to erase the young apprentice who had started this journey. Lyra, the girl who loved the stars not as gears in a machine, but as beautiful, distant fires, would cease to exist, drowned in the ocean of a god's memory. Anchoring herself was like trying to hold onto a single grain of sand in a desert storm. She clawed her way back to one fixed point, the one purpose that was uniquely hers, born from her own mortal heart. The Nexus, the vision of time rippling into chaos, of civilizations blinking out and freezing solid, that was not an abstract problem to the Titans. It was a trivial malfunction. But to Lyra, it was everything. It was the story of every life being lived, every hope, every loss. It was the very possibility of a future. She focused on the image of Kalin, his sorrowful compassion. She clung to the feeling of wonder she had felt creating the butterfly. These were her memories, her emotions, the pillars of her own fragile identity. She did not try to fight the tidal wave of knowledge that would have been like a leaf trying to stop a river. Instead, she let it flow through her, but she stood firm in the center of the storm, repeating her own name like a mantra, reaffirming her own mission. She would use this power, but she would not be replaced by it. The stakes were no longer about life and death, but about the preservation of her very soul. The question was whether a mortal mind could house the consciousness of a god without being utterly annihilated. Slowly, painfully, a new equilibrium began to form. It was not a victory, but a tense, precarious integration. The Titan's knowledge became a library to which she had access, rather than a voice that shouted over her own. She could understand the celestial mechanics of the Nexus's failure with a depth that made her previous understanding seem childish. But the driving force behind the repair was still her own compassionate need to heal. She had become a vessel, a unique fusion of mortal resolve and ancient power. As this balance settled, the chamber around her responded to the completed bond. The low hum of the forge deepened into a clear, resonant chord that seemed to vibrate through the fabric of space itself. The stone walls, the anvil, the very air began to shimmer and lose their solidity, dissolving into pure, structured light. The mountain forge was transforming, shedding its physical shell to reveal its true nature. The chamber stretched, elongated, and solidified into a breathtaking bridge of solidified radiance, a pathway that arced through the void, its far end pointing with unerring accuracy towards the faint, stuttering pulse of the dying Nexus constellation, a lifeline thrown across the abyss. The bridge of light was not a path one walked upon, but a current one was carried by. As Lyra and Kalin stepped onto its shimmering surface, they felt not a solid footing, but a gentle, irresistible pull, as if they had stepped into the center of a flowing river of pure energy. The mountain forge vanished behind them, shrinking to a distant pinprick, and the void of space opened around them, a breathtaking, terrifying immensity of darkness, punctuated by the cold, steady fire of galaxies. Ahead, their destination glimmered, but it was a sickly light. The Nexus constellation was not a beautiful cluster of stars. From this vantage, it was a wounded heart, its 7 pulsars flashing in a ragged, syncopated rhythm that felt fundamentally wrong, a drumbeat signaling a universe falling out of tune. The journey had begun, and with it, a new kind of fear, the fear of the journey itself. The temporal distortions hit them not as a wave, but as a series of violent, unpredictable shudders. One moment, the bridge was a stable ribbon of gold, carrying them smoothly forward. The next, it would flicker, its substance growing thin and translucent as ancient glass. Lyra would look down and see not the comforting glow of the path, but the infinite, hungry blackness of the void beneath her feet. Worse than the visual disorientation were the effects on their own sense of self. A ripple would pass over them, and for a fraction of a second, Lyra would be overwhelmed by the vivid, disorienting sensation of being a very old woman, her bones aching with the weight of centuries she had not lived. Then, just as quickly, it would reverse, and she would feel the terrifying confusion of infancy, a raw awareness without memory or language, the universe, a blur of overwhelming light and sound. Kalin, his crystalline form, more attuned to the fabric of reality, fared little better. His light would stutter and dim under the assault, his geometric shape warping slightly as if seen through flawed glass. The conflict was immediate and visceral. This was not a battle against a creature or a person, but a struggle against the very environment, a fight to maintain a coherent timeline for their own minds amidst the chaotic soup of broken causality. A single misstep, A moment of lost focus, and the bridge might not simply vanish. It might deposit them into a random point in time, stranding them millennia in the past or future, or worse, in the fractured non-time between moments, forever lost. Lyra's first instinct was to push more power from the forge into the bridge, to try and bulldoze through the distortions with sheer force. But the Titan's knowledge, now a part of her, screamed a warning. Force was what had caused the initial instability in the mountain. Here, at the epicenter of the temporal breakdown, applying brute energy would be like throwing gasoline on a fire. It would only feed the chaos. They needed not power, but precision. They needed an anchor. Gritting her teeth against the disorienting lurch of another time shift, this one making her nauseous with the sensation of falling upwards, she focused on the keystone in her hand. It was cool and steady, a point of absolute calm in the storm. She understood its purpose now. It was not an amplifier, but a regulator. Instead of channeling energy outward, she turned its function inward, asking it to define a space, to draw a line in the sand against the encroaching chaos. With a thought that required immense concentration, she activated it. A sphere of perfect, stable normality bloomed around them, a bubble about 10 paces wide that traveled with them along the bridge. Inside this bubble, the air was still, and time flowed in its familiar, linear fashion. The terrifying flashes of age and youth ceased. The bridge beneath their feet solidified, its glow constant and reassuring. It was an oasis of sanity in a desert of madness, but the cost was excruciating. Lyra felt as if she were physically holding up the walls of this fragile reality against a pressure that wanted to crush it. The strain was not on her muscles, but on her spirit, on the very connection that bound her to the forge. It was a relentless drain, like trying to hold her breath indefinitely while running a marathon. Each second the bubble held firm felt like an hour, and a cold sweat beaded on her forehead. She could feel her own vitality, already diminished from her previous trials, being steadily siphoned away to maintain this tiny pocket of order. Kalin, sensing her struggle, moved closer, his own light pulsing in a steady, calming rhythm, a beacon for her to focus on. He could not share the burden, but his presence was a tether to her purpose, a reminder of why this agonizing effort was necessary. The stakes of their mission were now terrifyingly direct and physical. The cosmic scale of saving time itself had been abstract, a noble goal that felt almost philosophical. But here, on this flickering bridge, the danger was immediate and personal. A lapse in her concentration, the keystone slipping from her weakening grip, and the bubble would pop. The full, maddening force of the temporal storm would crash down upon them instantly. They wouldn't be killed in a conventional sense. They would be unmade, their personal timelines scrambled into nonsense. They could be torn into fragments, each piece of their consciousness cast adrift into a different era, forever aware but never whole. Or they could simply be erased, their existence negated by a paradox, as if they had never been born at all. This was no longer about heroic sacrifice. It was about the brutal, minute-by-minute endurance required to simply arrive at the battlefield alive. Every shudder of the bridge, every flicker at the edge of their protective bubble, was a reminder that failure was not an end point waiting for them at the Nexus. Failure was a constant companion on the journey, waiting for a single moment of weakness. Through the shimmering wall of the time bubble, the central pulsar of the Nexus grew from a distant flicker to a massive, looming presence. It was a star of impossible density, and even in its failing state, it radiated an aura of immense power. It should have been a beacon of pure, rhythmic light, a heart beating in the chest of the cosmos. But as they drew near, the nature of its ailment became horrifyingly clear. The star was shrouded in a strange, viscous darkness that was not merely an absence of light. This darkness seemed to absorb the pulsar's radiance, sucking it away like a parasite. Tendrils of this gloom latched onto the star's surface, pulsing with a sickening, rhythmic throb that mirrored and was choking the star's own natural beat. They had reached their destination, but the sight that greeted them was not a mechanical failure they could fix. It was an infection. The heart of time itself was being consumed by a shadow born from the void between the stars. The true horror of the situation became chillingly clear as they drew closer. This was no simple malfunction or wound in the star. The darkness clinging to the pulsar was alive. It was a void-born parasite, a creature of pure consumption that had latched onto the heart of the Nexus to feed on the most potent energy source imaginable, time itself. Its form was a shifting, oily smear against the star's brilliant surface, but it pulsed with a terrible, rhythmic vitality, its tendrils digging deep into the pulsar's core like roots, sucking the life from a tree. Each throb of the parasite corresponded with a weakening stutter from the star, a direct and gruesome symbiosis where one entity lived only by devouring the other. The consequences of this discovery were immediate and dire. Lyra's entire plan, the reason she had bonded with the Forge and risked this perilous journey, was to channel a surge of pure creative energy into the Pulsar to restart it. But now she understood that such an action would be the worst possible thing she could do. Directly applying the Forge's power would be like offering a starving beast a grand feast. The parasite would gorge itself on the influx, growing stronger and more entrenched, accelerating the Pulsar's demise until it was drained completely. Their greatest weapon had just been rendered useless, turning their mission from a repair job into a delicate surgical extraction against a patient that was also the surgeon's predator. The conflict shifted from a race against chaos to a desperate puzzle with no obvious solution. How do you remove a creature that feeds on the very substance you would use to remove it? They couldn't attack it. They couldn't force it. Any application of energy, whether from the Forge or Kalin's own luminous form, would only strengthen their enemy. They were trapped in a terrible paradox, hovering just outside the reach of the temporal storm, protected by Lyra's straining bubble, but utterly powerless to affect the core of the problem. The tension was a suffocating pressure, the silence between them filled with the awful, irregular heartbeat of the dying star. They had journeyed across the void, survived the unraveling of time itself, only to be held at bay by a fundamental rule of nature. You cannot fight a fire by throwing fuel upon it. It was Kalin who broke the silence, his voice a soft, solemn chime that carried a weight of finality. He had watched the cosmos for eons, and in his long vigil, he had learned the patterns of such abominations. He explained that his own nature, his body of crystalline, structured light, was fundamentally different from the raw, temporal energy of the Forge and the Pulsar. It was ordered, rigid, almost mathematical in its purity. To a creature that craved the chaotic flow of time, his essence would be indigestible, like trying to eat stone. And so, he proposed a sacrifice. He would venture out from the protective bubble and engage the parasite directly. He would not attack it, but would make himself a target, a brilliant, irritating distraction. He would draw the creature's attention, allowing its feeding tendrils to latch onto him instead of the pulsar, while it was confused and occupied, trying to consume a power source it could not process. Lyra would have a precious, fleeting window to attempt the realignment of the star. It was a gambit born of sheer desperation, a plan that relied entirely on the parasite's instincts, overriding its intelligence. The stakes of their mission escalated once more, but this time in a deeply personal and agonizing way. It was no longer just about the abstract concept of saving time. The cost of victory was now measured in the potential loss of her only companion, the being who had transformed from her jailer into her guide. Kalin was offering to be the bait in a trap from which there might be no return. Even if the parasite could not digest him, it could still overwhelm him, encasing his crystalline form in its corrosive darkness until his light was extinguished forever. Lyra was faced with an impossible choice. Was saving the universe worth the life of the one who had shown her its true wonder? Could she accept a victory that came stained with the loss of her friend? This was the ultimate test of a guardian's resolve, a moment where the greater good demanded a personal sacrifice, so profound it threatened to hollow out the victory itself. The weight of the decision pressed down on her, colder and heavier than the void around them. As Kalin began to gather his energy, his form brightening in preparation for his solitary charge, Lyra's mind rebelled against the grim calculus of his plan. There had to be another way. Surrendering to the tidal wave of the Titan's memories she had fought so hard to control, she stopped trying to anchor herself against them and instead dove in. She let the eons of cosmic knowledge wash over her, not as a threat to her identity, but as a vast library she was now permitted to browse. She sifted through memories of galaxy formation, of stellar nurseries, of the birth and death of realities. She was looking for a precedent, a story, a fragment of an idea about dealing with such parasites. And then she found it. It wasn't a battle plan or a weapon schematic. It was a tale, a parable the Titans told about the nature of energy and attraction. It spoke of sympathetic resonance, the principle that a powerful vibration in one object can cause a similar object to vibrate in harmony. The lesson was not about confrontation, but about persuasion. You don't fight the hungry beast. You lead it away with the scent of a better meal. The idea ignited in her mind, not as a strategy of war, but as a principle of nature. Sympathetic resonance. The story from the Titan's memory was not about building a better weapon. It was about understanding a deeper hunger. This parasite was not evil. It was simply a creature of the void, acting on its most basic instinct, to feed. It had found the richest meal in the cosmos and latched on. Fighting it directly would only make it cling tighter, like prying at the roots of a plant embedded in stone. But what if she could offer it something even better? Not a threat, but a temptation. The conflict shifted from a desperate battle to a delicate negotiation, a test of wits against pure biology. She focused her will, not on the pulsar or the parasite, but on the empty space, a significant distance away. She reached into the Valacirca Forge, but this time, she asked it for something profoundly difficult and exquisitely precise. She did not ask for a blast of power to destroy or to heal. She asked it to perform an act of pure, focused creation. She envisioned a point of perfect density, a gravitational anchor so stable and self-contained that it would warp space-time around itself in a gentle, continuous loop. She was asking the forge to weave a miniature, stable singularity, a black hole in embryo, not one that devoured, but one that hummed. This tiny knot in reality would be a perfect battery, a self-renewing fountain of the very temporal energy the parasite craved, but contained, concentrated, and far more accessible than the vast, struggling heart of the pulsar. It was the ultimate lure. The effort of this creation was unlike anything she had yet attempted. Mending a star had been like restarting a stalled engine. This was like building an entirely new engine from scratch, atom by atom, in the void. She felt the drain immediately, a cold, sharp pull that started in the sigil on her palm and shot through her entire being. This was not the forge's energy being channeled. This was her own life force, the last dregs of her mortal vitality, being used as the fundamental ingredient, the spark to ignite this new cosmic phenomenon. The protective time bubble around them flickered violently as her concentration wavered under the strain. Kalin, sensing her peril, steadied her with a hand on her shoulder, his own light flowing into her not as power, but as support, a silent affirmation of her chosen path. She clung to that presence, using it as an anchor as she poured the very essence of who she was into the act of creation. When it was done, the singularity hung in the void, a perfect sphere of absolute blackness that was not an absence, but a presence. It did not suck in light. It held it in a tight, shimmering halo, and from its event horizon emanated a deep, thrumming vibration, the rhythm of creation itself. It was beautiful and terrifying, but the cost was devastating. As the last thread of energy left her, Lyra's knees buckled. The strength fled her body, leaving her frail and hollow, a shell. She could no longer stand on her own. She slumped against Kalin, her breathing shallow. The connection to the forge was still there, but it felt different now. It was no longer a tool she wielded. It was a life support system, a cord tethering her fading spirit to the world of the living. Her own power was utterly spent. She had gambled everything, betting her last spark on the hope that a hungry beast would prefer a carefully prepared feast to the cumbersome, dying giant it currently fed upon. The tension in that moment was absolute, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the very sound of the stuttering pulsar. Everything hinged on a creature's simple instinct. Had she understood its nature correctly? Was the concentrated, easy meal of the singularity more attractive than the vast, difficult banquet of the Nexus? It was her final roll of the dice, and the stakes were the universe and the last whisper of her own life. For a long, agonizing second, nothing happened. The parasite continued its rhythmic pulsing on the pulsar's surface, oblivious. A cold dread began to seep into Lyra's heart. She had failed. She had given everything for nothing. Then a change. One of the dark, oily tendrils attached to the star twitched. It lifted slightly, wavering in the void like a snake tasting the air. It had sensed the vibration, the siren song of the singularity. Slowly, almost hesitantly, the tendril detached from the pulsar and stretched out towards the new energy source. Then another tendril followed, and another. The parasite's central mass began to shift, its attention irrevocably drawn away from the fading heart of time and towards the bright, new, and infinitely more tempting meal Lyra had placed before it. It was a slow, deliberate migration, a predator turning from a tough, old kill to a fresh, tender offering. The gamble had worked. The persuasion had begun. The moment stretched into an eternity, a silent, breathless vigil at the edge of oblivion. Lyra, her body a hollow vessel, held upright only by Kalin's steadying presence, watched as the void-born parasite continued its slow, deliberate migration. Each oily tendril that uncurled from the Pulsar's feverish surface was a small victory, a thread of life released from a strangling grip. But the true test was yet to come. The creature was distracted, but it was not yet fully detached. Its deepest roots still clung to the star, a final, tenacious connection to the power that had sustained it for so long. This was the critical juncture, the fragile opportunity that Kalin's plan had created. With the parasite's attention firmly locked on the shimmering singularity, Kalin moved. There was no grand, dramatic gesture, no battle cry echoed across the void. His action was one of pure, precise elegance, the work of a master surgeon operating on the heart of the universe itself. He did not attack the main body of the creature. That would have been like striking a tree's branches to kill its roots. Instead, he focused his entire being, his crystalline form blazing with a light so intensely concentrated, it was almost painful to behold. He channeled that light into a blade of pure, coherent energy, finer than a laser and sharper than any physical edge. Then, with an accuracy born of eons of observation, he aimed not at the parasite, but at the points of contact. He swept his luminous blade through the weakened connection points, the places where the tendrils met the Pulsar's corona. It was not a violent severing, but a clean, surgical cut. Where his light touched the corrupted bonds, they dissolved, not with a scream of protest, but with a silent, almost grateful sigh of release. The last few tendrils, sensing the loss of their anchor, recoiled instinctively and joined the main mass of the creature as it flowed wholly towards the new, tantalizing energy source Lyra had created. The great unbinding was complete. The Pulsar was free. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The massive star simply hung in the void, dark and silent, a corpse from which the parasite had finally finished feeding. Then a sound echoed through the vacuum, a sensation felt rather than heard, a deep, resonant thrum. It was weak, hesitant, like the first, faltering heartbeat of a newborn. A single point of light flickered on the star's surface, then another. The Pulsar's natural rhythm, suppressed for so long, was struggling to reassert itself. It gave a weak but steady pulse of light, a thrum that was music to Lyra's soul. It was not the strong, confident beat of a healthy heart, but it was a pulse. It was life. Simultaneously, the parasite, now fully enveloping the miniature singularity, seemed to settle into a state of contented consumption. The singularity, designed as a perfect battery, contained the creature completely, its event horizon acting as an unbreakable prison wall. The immediate, monstrous threat was neutralized, contained within a cage of its own gluttony, but the relief was tragically short-lived. Lyra watched the Pulsar's struggling light, and with the Titan's knowledge now an integral part of her understanding, she knew the grim truth. The star was free, but it was dying. The parasite had drained it too deeply, sapping its core energy beyond its ability to recover on its own. The weak, rhythmic thrum was not the beginning of a recovery. It was a death rattle, the final, faint echoes of a star on the verge of permanent collapse. The Nexus constellation could not restart with a heart that was only barely beating. The celestial clockwork required a powerful, steady rhythm to drive its gears. This faltering pulse was insufficient. The immediate threat was gone, but the ultimate failure was still hurtling towards them, merely delayed by a few precious moments. The conflict now raged entirely within Lyra. The physical battle was over, but the moral and personal one reached its devastating climax. She felt the truth in the profound emptiness of her own body. The creation of the singularity had drained the last reserves of her mortal strength. She was a wisp, a ghost, clinging to existence only through the thin, sustaining thread of her bond with the Valacirca Forge. She knew what had to happen next. The Pulsar needed a jump start, a massive infusion of pure creative energy to shock its core back into a sustainable fusion reaction. It needed the full, unrestrained power of the Forge, channeled through the keystone and focused into a single, life-giving surge, and she was the only conduit. Such an act would require pushing the Forge to its absolute limit, and in doing so, it would demand the last vestiges of her own life force to complete the circuit. There was no other way. The knowledge settled upon her not as a fear, but as a cold, absolute certainty. This was the purpose she had been moving towards from the moment she first touched the anvil. Her journey was not about proving her worth, it was about spending it. The stakes escalated to their final, unbearable height. The choice was no longer about risk, it was about acceptance. Success meant the salvation of creation, the restoration of time, the continuation of every story being lived across the infinite cosmos, but the price was her own end. There would be no triumphant return to the mountain, no reconciliation with Master Orrin, no long years of study and wonder. Her story would conclude here, at the heart of the universe, in a final, brilliant act of selfless giving. It was the ultimate sacrifice, and the weight of it should have been crushing. Yet, as she looked at the struggling star, she felt a profound and surprising peace. This was not a tragic end. It was the fulfillment of a purpose greater than herself. Her initial defiance had been transformed, through trial and wisdom, into a willing offering. Summoning the dregs of her strength, she turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting the luminous facets of Kalin's form. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, a thread of sound carried on the stellar winds, but it was filled with a calm authority that belied her frailty. She began to give him instructions, a quiet, rapid transfer of essential knowledge. She explained the rhythms of the Forge, how to sense its moods, how to communicate with the living consciousness within the mountain after she was gone. She told him of the new tradition that must be started, of the need to guide the next generation of star forgers, to ensure the hands that carved the heavens would never again be forgotten. She was not just saving the universe, she was entrusting its future care to her friend, passing the torch with her final breath. Her words were not a lament, but a legacy. With her final instructions given and her fate accepted, Lyra turned her full attention to the faltering heart of the universe. There was no fanfare, no grand pronouncement. It was a moment of profound, silent focus. She reached deep, not into the Forge as a separate tool, but into the bond they now shared, a symbiosis of mortal spirit and ancient cosmic will. She did not command the power, she invited it, opening herself completely as a conduit for a force that had been waiting eons for this exact purpose. The keystone in her hand blazed, its swirling nebula patterns solidifying into a lens of pure, focused intent. And then, the energy came. It was not a stream or a river, but a tidal wave of creation, a torrent of raw potential that had once ignited the first stars. This was the full, unrestrained might of the Valacirca Forge, and it flowed into her, through her, with the force of a supernova. The sensation was beyond pain or pleasure. It was an unraveling and a reweaving all at once. Every cell in her body sang with the energy of the Big Bang itself. She felt the Forge's consciousness merge with her own, not as an overwhelming flood this time, but as a partner in a final, sacred dance. Together, they directed the colossal surge of power towards the central pulsar, aiming not for its surface, but for its dying core. The energy was a needle of pure life, stitching the star's fractured heart back together. Inside the pulsar, the faltering nuclear fires, starved and weakened by the parasite's feast, were suddenly drowned in a deluge of primordial light. The chaotic, dying embers were quenched and reborn, fused into a new, stable, and fiercely burning core. The process was not a gentle healing. It was a cosmic defibrillation, a shock to a system on the brink of flatlining. As the pulsar's core reignited, the effect was instantaneous and magnificent. The star, which had been a dim, sickly ember, flared into a beacon of pure, white-hot radiance. Its light was a physical force, a wave that washed over the entire Nexus constellation. The other 6 pulsars, which had been stuttering in their own isolated agony, were caught in the wake of this rebirth. One by one, they synced to the new, powerful rhythm, their individual pulses locking into a perfect, harmonious beat. 7 hearts began to drum as one, their synchronized light pulsing out across the cosmos in a steady, unwavering cadence. The temporal ripples that had been twisting reality, causing stars to age to dust in an instant and others to freeze in a single moment, suddenly smoothed out. The chaotic waves settled into a calm, linear flow. Across countless galaxies, time itself took a deep, steadying breath and resumed its normal, relentless march. The great celestial clock, its mainspring restored, began to tick once more. For Lyra, this cosmic restoration was experienced as a personal dissolution. The conflict was entirely internal, a desperate, fading battle fought on the edges of her own consciousness. Holding the channel open required every last shred of her being. She felt her life force, the essence of who she was as Lyra, being spent like currency to pay for the universe's renewal. It was a candle burning at both ends, blazing with incredible brilliance for one final, glorious moment. Her awareness of the external world, the reignited pulsars, the stabilizing heavens, began to dim, replaced by a growing, welcoming silence. Thoughts of the mountain, of Master Orrin, of Kalin, flickered and faded like distant stars at dawn. There was no fear, only a profound and weary satisfaction. She had seen the job through. Her initial act of defiance, born of a desperate need to prove herself, had been refined in the crucible of sacrifice, transforming into this ultimate act of selfless creation. She had not just fixed a broken gear, she had reignited the engine of reality. She held on, refusing to let go, until the very last pulse of energy passed from her into the star. She felt the final connection snap into place, the last celestial gear click into alignment with a certainty that resonated through the fabric of existence. Only then, when the work was irrevocably and perfectly done, did she allow her grasp to loosen. The brilliant light of the forge that had surrounded her like a second skin winked out. The sustaining connection severed, the torrent of power ceased, and with it, the last spark of her mortal strength was extinguished. The sense of weightlessness was immediate and absolute. There was no more bridge beneath her feet, no more stellar winds against her skin. There was only a gentle, inexorable pull, a falling away from the light she had helped create, a quiet surrender to the vast and silent dark. There was no pain, only a profound and absolute silence. The brilliant surge of power that had reignited the heart of the universe was gone, and with it, the last vestige of Lyra's strength. The bridge of light, its purpose fulfilled, dissolved into shimmering motes around her. For a single, weightless moment, she hung in the void, a solitary figure against the now steady pulse of the Nexus. Then she fell. It was not a violent plummet, but a slow, graceful drift, like an ember cooling after a great fire has burned itself out. Her body, drained of all vitality, was barely more substantial than stardust, and the endless dark reached up to claim her. The victory was complete. The heavens were saved, but the price lay suspended in the silent vastness, a life given freely now slipping away. But she was not alone. As Lyra fell into the welcoming darkness, a second light pierced the void. Kalin, who had witnessed her ultimate sacrifice, did not hesitate. His crystalline form, still bright from his own efforts, became a comet of pure intent. He dove after her, not with the slow deliberation of a celestial being, but with the desperate speed of a friend. The distance between them closed in an instant. He did not catch her with hands of stone or force, but wove a net of gentle luminescence from the very light of his being, a soft, resilient web that cradled her falling form as one might cradle a wounded bird. The impact was barely a whisper, a tender meeting of spent hero and eternal guardian. She was alive, but only just. Her chest rose and fell with shallow, almost imperceptible breaths. The connection to the keystone, that bond which had fused her with the forge, was now the thinnest of silver threads, the only thing tethering her fading spirit to the physical world. She was a ghost of herself, a memory held together by a promise. The immediate, cosmic danger had passed. The pulsars beat their steady rhythm, and time flowed smoothly once more across the galaxies. Yet, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of tension, one of heartbreaking consequence. The victory felt hollowed out by the sight of its architect, lying so frail and broken. The conflict was no longer against a parasite or a failing mechanism. It was against the cruel arithmetic of sacrifice. Lyra had traded her life for the universe's, and the sheer, devastating clarity of that exchange hung heavily in the air. The question was no longer if the heavens would survive, but whether the heavens could give something back. Kalin looked from the perfectly ordered stars to the dying girl in his arms, and a profound decision crystallized within him. Returning to the mountain, to the elders and their limited understanding, was not an option. Their methods were for preserving life, not for restoring one that had been spent on a cosmic scale. Lyra needed something more, something as miraculous as the act she had just performed. His gaze turned from the deep void of the Nexus towards a familiar, gentle pattern of stars, the constellation of Serpentarius, the serpent bearer. It was the first constellation Lyra had ever mended, the spark that had ignited this entire epic journey. But now, healed by her own hands and humming with the restored energy of the cosmos, it was more than just a picture in the sky. It was a place, the heart of that constellation, where the serpent's coils cradled a cluster of young, vibrant stars, was known in the oldest legends as a cradle of restorative energy. It was said that time itself flowed differently there, not in chaotic ripples, but in a gentle, restorative current that could soothe the most profound wounds of the spirit, and perhaps even the body. It was a long shot, a hope built on myth and the faintest whisper of cosmic sympathy, but it was the only hope he had. The stakes of their story shifted dramatically in that moment. They were no longer about the survival of creation, but about the meaning of that survival. Was the universe a colder, poorer place for having consumed its savior? Or did the very fabric of reality hold within it a capacity for gratitude, a way to heal the hands that had carved it? Kalin was betting everything on the latter. He would not let her sacrifice be a mere transaction. Cradling her carefully in his net of light, he turned his back on the mighty Nexus and oriented himself towards the softer, welcoming glow of Serpentarius. He was not just carrying a wounded comrade, he was carrying a hope, the hope that the sky, now whole because of her, would recognize its own and offer a miracle in return. With a final, lingering look at the steady pulse of the revived heart of time, he began the journey, moving with a purposeful grace towards the constellation that had started it all, a place where time itself was said to have healing properties. Consciousness returned not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, gentle dawning. The first thing Lyra became aware of was the absence of pain. There was no crushing weight on her chest, no agonizing drain in her limbs. She felt whole, intact, but the world she awoke to was not the familiar, cold stone of the Valacirca Forge. She was suspended within a soft, golden luminescence, a nebula of warm light that cradled her like a hammock woven from sunlight itself. Tiny, shimmering motes of stardust drifted lazily around her, and in the gentle distance, she could see the distinct, comforting patterns of the Serpentarius constellation, its stars burning with a healthy, steady light she herself had restored. This was the heart of the serpent bearer, the celestial cradle Kalin had brought her to. The sky itself had become her sanctuary. Her first instinctive movement was to look at her right hand, to the palm that bore the mark of her choices. The sigil was still there, the intricate pattern etched into her skin by the forge's first acceptance, but its fierce, fiery glow was gone. Instead, it was pale, like a faded tattoo or a scar that had healed over many years. It was no longer a brand burning with potential energy, but a quiet reminder. When she reached inward, towards the place in her mind where the connection to the Valacirca Forge had once roared like a furnace, she found not a void, but a profound silence. The forge was not gone. She could feel its presence like a distant mountain on the horizon, solid and eternal. But the direct line of power, the ability to command its energy as her own, had vanished. The bond remained, but it had been transformed from one of mastery to one of deep, mutual respect. She was no longer its commander, but its acknowledged partner. This realization brought a quiet storm of confusion. For so long, her entire identity had been defined by her relationship to that power. She was the defiant apprentice who had stolen it, the desperate rogue who had wielded it, the selfless savior who had spent it. But now, who was she? The labels that had once confined and described her felt as faded as the sigil on her hand. She was no longer an apprentice, for she had surpassed any master. She was no longer a rogue, for her actions had been vindicated on a cosmic scale. She was a woman whole in body, yet adrift in purpose, floating in the aftermath of her own epic conclusion. The tension was not one of fear, but of profound disorientation, like a soldier returning from a long war to find home unfamiliar. Lying there in the golden light, she retraced the journey in her mind. The frantic defiance, the terrifying revelations, the agonizing sacrifices. She saw now that every step had been leading her away from the idea of ownership. Her initial desire to prove her worth by wielding the Forge's power had been a childish fantasy. The Forge had never been meant to be owned, to be controlled like a tool. It was a living will, a conscious force that desired not a master, but a servant, a partner. Her role, she understood with a clarity that settled deep into her bones, was never to possess the power, but to serve the purpose behind it. The greatness was not in the commanding, but in the yielding to a need greater than oneself. In spending everything, she had finally learned what it truly meant to be a star forger. A profound peace washed over her, warmer than the nebula's light. The disorientation melted away, replaced by a serene acceptance. The struggle for a specific identity was over. She did not need to be the hero or the outcast anymore. She could simply be Lyra, the one who had answered when the sky called. The personal journey that began with a tremulous hand on a forbidden anvil concluded here, not with a triumphant return, but with a quiet integration into the vast, beautiful machinery she had helped save. The stakes of her internal conflict resolved into this simple, powerful truth. Her worth was not measured by the power she held, but by the purpose to which she gave herself. As this acceptance solidified within her, the golden light around her seemed to brighten in response. From the shimmering haze, a familiar form coalesced. Kalin emerged, his crystalline body seeming to drink in the ambient light of the nebula, making him appear brighter, more vibrant than she had ever seen him. The sorrow that had once clouded his presence was gone, replaced by a calm, ancient wisdom. He did not speak immediately, but simply observed her, his luminous gaze taking in her restored form and the peaceful resolution in her eyes. He had witnessed her entire transformation, from reckless youth to selfless savior, and now to this state of quiet understanding. When he finally did speak, his voice was the soft chime of celestial bells, carrying an offer that was both a question and an invitation. The balance is restored, he intoned, but balance is not a static state. It is a perpetual dance, requiring vigilant eyes and gentle hands. The celestial clockwork needs more than repairmen. It needs guardians. It needs watchers. He extended a hand of solidified light, not as a command, but as a choice. Your journey does not have to end with the embers of a single sacrifice. It can continue with me as a protector of the infinite. The gentle light of the nebula seemed to hold its breath as Kalin's offer hung in the air between them. It was not a demand, but an invitation extended across the vast difference in their natures. He explained that the stability she had just fought so hard to restore was not a permanent state to be achieved and then forgotten. The heavens, in their infinite complexity, were a dynamic equilibrium, a perpetual dance of forces that required constant, vigilant caretaking. A single misaligned asteroid, the natural decay of an ancient star, or the unforeseen birth of a new black hole, any of these could introduce a ripple that, left unchecked, might grow into a wave capable of upsetting the delicate balance of entire galaxies. This was not the work of a mechanic who fixes a broken machine and walks away. It was the work of a gardener who understands that tending is a never-ending act of love and attention. The role of a watcher, as he described it, was for those who possessed a deep, intuitive understanding of both creation and the sacrifice it often demands, a wisdom she had just proven she possessed in its most profound form. The consequences of accepting were as vast and chilling as the void itself. To say yes would be to sever her ties to the mortal world with a finality more absolute than death. She would leave behind not just the mountain and the elders, but the very experience of time as she knew it. The slow, sweet change of seasons, the gradual aging of a face, the simple pleasure of a shared meal that would become a memory. All of that would fade into the background of an existence measured in eons. She would become a timeless being, her consciousness woven into the fabric of the cosmos, walking among the stars as a permanent part of their story. The girl who had once been Lyra of the mountain would effectively cease to be, her personal history becoming a prologue to an eternal present. It was the ultimate departure, a journey from which there was no return ticket, not even the hope of one. This realization sparked the final, quiet conflict within her. The choice was agonizingly clear. One path led back to a mortal life. She could return to the Star Forgers, to Master Orrin and the others. Her heroic actions would undoubtedly earn her forgiveness, even reverence. She could reclaim her place, teach what she had learned, and live out a full life, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of the mountain. It was the comfortable, known quantity, a life that promised connection, however flawed, and an end that was part of the natural order. The other path was one of unimaginable loneliness. To stand guard over a universe that would never know her name, to watch civilizations rise and fall like waves on a shore, to be a silent witness to infinity. The sheer scale of that isolation was terrifying. It was a duty that promised no retirement, no rest, and a companionship limited to other eternal beings like Kalin. The tension was between the heart's longing for home and the spirit's call to a purpose so grand it dwarfed individual desire. Lyra did not need long to reflect. As she weighed the two futures, she looked not at Kalin, but past him, through the shimmering veil of the nebula to the star-strewn tapestry beyond. She saw the steady, healthy pulse of Serpentarius, the constellation whose silent cry for help had started her on this path. She thought of the Nexus, its rhythm now strong and true, ensuring time flowed for countless lives across countless worlds. And she understood that the deepest desire that had always burned within her was not for acceptance from the elders, nor for a long and peaceful life. It was a simpler, more powerful need to protect the sky, to ensure that its beauty and order would endure, that its stories would continue to be written. The mortal life she would return to now felt small, like trying to fit an ocean back into a thimble. Accepting Kalin's offer was not a loss of her old life. It was the fulfillment of her truest self. It was the answer to the call she had always heard when she looked up at the night. Her decision, once made, felt less like a choice and more like a confirmation of a truth she had always known. With a calm certainty that settled deep into her soul, she met Kalin's luminous gaze and gave a single, slow nod. "I will join you," she said, her voice soft but unwavering in the immense silence. "I will be a watcher." In that moment, the transformation that had been unfolding through trial and sacrifice was finalized. The apprentice who had once trembled before a forbidden anvil was gone. In her place was something new, a being whose story was now inextricably linked to the grand narrative of the cosmos itself. She was no longer just Lyra. She was becoming a myth in the making, a permanent guardian in the celestial legends. As her agreement resonated in the space between them, a gentle warmth bloomed on her palm. She looked down to see the faded sigil, the mark of the Valacirca Forge, begin to glow once more. But the light was different this time. It was not the fierce, fiery orange of the forge's raw power, an energy that demanded and consumed. This was a softer, steadier luminescence, a cool, silvery white that pulsed with the gentle, rhythmic light of the stars themselves. It was no longer a brand of ownership or a conduit for channeling force. It had become a badge of office, a permanent connection to the cosmic currents she had sworn to protect, a quiet promise etched into her very being that her watch had now begun. The transition from mortal hero to eternal student was the most humbling experience of Lyra's existence. Her greatest triumph, the reignition of the Nexus, had been an act of immense, self-sacrificing power. But now, standing beside Kalin in the quiet expanse between galaxies, she was learning that true guardianship required not power, but perception. Her first lesson began not with a lecture on cosmic mechanics, but with a simple, profound instruction. "Listen," Kalin said, his voice a soft vibration in the void. "Not with your ears, but with the part of you that now belongs to the stars. Listen for the music." At first, Lyra heard only the immense silence of space, a profound emptiness that felt more like an absence of sound than a thing in itself. She strained, focusing her will as she had when channeling the forge, trying to force the universe to reveal its secrets, but Kalin gently corrected her. "You are trying to command it," he chimed. "You must instead learn to receive it, let go of the need to do, and simply be a part of the chorus." It was a difficult shift for someone whose every recent memory was defined by desperate action. Closing her eyes, she allowed her awareness to soften, to expand, to stop seeking and start accepting. And then she heard it. It was not a melody with notes as a mortal would understand them, but a vast, complex tapestry of vibrations. It was the music of the spheres, a symphony of gravitational pulls, solar winds, planetary rotations, and the slow, deep hum of space-time itself. A healthy star system sang a bright, steady chord. A spinning nebula contributed a shimmering, ethereal harmony. It was beautiful beyond description, a celestial orchestra playing on an infinite stage. Learning to perceive this music was one thing. Learning to understand its language was another challenge entirely. Kalin taught her to identify the subtle dissonances within the grand symphony, the faint, discordant wail of a star experiencing unstable fusion, the choked, sputtering rhythm of a planet whose magnetic field was weakening, or the ominous, deep silence that indicated a region where the natural flow of time was being subtly eroded. She was no longer a mechanic looking at a broken gear. She was a musician with an impossibly vast instrument, learning that a single note played slightly out of tune in one corner of the cosmos could create a disturbing resonance light years away. Her new role was one of subtle tuning, of gentle adjustments, not of grand, heroic repairs. The stakes of this new understanding were immediately and terrifyingly personal. During an early exercise, Lyra attempted to correct a minor harmonic imbalance in a distant, uninhabited asteroid belt. Her adjustment was too forceful, a remnant of her old, direct approach. Instead of a gentle realignment, she created a tiny but sharp temporal hiccup. For a fraction of a second, 1,000 asteroids within the belt experienced a burst of accelerated time, their surfaces aging millennia in an instant, covered in a frost of cosmic dust that should have taken eons to accumulate. It was a minor event in the grand scheme, affecting no life, but to Lyra, it felt like a catastrophic failure. The ripple of that small mistake echoed back to her through the music as a jarring, painful screech. Kalin did not scold her. Instead, he simply guided her awareness to the affected area, allowing her to feel the consequences of her heavy-handedness. A watcher's touch must be lighter than a photon's kiss, he explained, his tone not of anger, but of experience. The universe is a web of delicate connections. Pull too hard on one thread, and you may unravel a pattern in a place you cannot see. This lesson sank deeper than any warning about cosmic catastrophe. It was about responsibility on a microscopic scale, about the absolute necessity of precision and patience. From that moment on, Lyra approached each lesson with a profound humility that had been forged in the fire of her own mistake. She embraced her identity as a perpetual student, understanding that the cosmos was too vast, too complex, for anyone to ever truly master. There would always be a new harmony to learn, a new dissonance to decipher. Her ambition to prove herself was completely gone, replaced by a quiet, relentless curiosity. This new, patient approach began to yield beautiful results. She learned to make corrections so subtle they were almost imperceptible, nudging a gravitational field here, soothing a turbulent stellar flare there. Each successful, gentle adjustment was rewarded with a corresponding sweetening of the cosmic symphony in that region, a feeling of profound rightness that was more satisfying than any applause from a mortal audience. She was learning the deepest truth of her role, that guardianship was not about control, but about stewardship. It was a silent, endless conversation with the universe, a dialogue of immense subtlety and grace. She was finding her place not as a ruler of the heavens, but as one of its most attentive caretakers. It was during one of these deep, meditative sessions, as she was carefully attuning herself to the gentle rhythms of a newborn star cluster, that a faint, discordant signal brushed against her awareness. It was not a sound of natural cosmic decay or a void-born threat. This was a signature she knew intimately, a frequency etched into her very soul. It was the unique energy signature of the Valacirca Forge, and it was pulsing with a distinct, frantic rhythm she recognized immediately. It was a call for help, emanating from the distant, familiar slopes of her mountain home. The faint, familiar echo from the Valacirca mountain was a discordant note in the symphony she was learning to hear, a tremor of distress that pulled her awareness away from the tranquil depths of interstellar space. Following the signal back to its source was like tracing a single thread in a vast tapestry. Her consciousness, flowing along the unique energy signature of the forge, until the familiar forge chamber snapped into focus in her mind's eye. But the scene she witnessed was one of frantic, futile struggle. Master Orrin and the other elders were not gathered in ceremony or study. They were in a state of desperate containment. The Valacirca Forge, once a dormant relic, now hummed with a vibrant, restless life, and that life was leaking out in unpredictable surges of raw starlight. The elders moved around the anvil with the rigid, by-the-book gestures of their ancient training, chanting stabilization hymns that had worked for centuries on a silent, sleeping tool. But their efforts were like trying to calm a startled wild animal by reading it a list of rules. The forge's energy bucked and flared against their attempts. Its new, awakened consciousness, finding their rigid methods not just ineffective, but irritating. They were trying to put a lid on a volcano with a cork, and the strain on their aged, worried faces was painfully clear. In the silent expanse between stars, Lyra felt the weight of the decision settle upon her. Here was the community that had cast her out, the authority figures who had labeled her a dangerous rogue. To intervene would be to step back into that old conflict, to face their judgment not as a frightened apprentice, but as something they could not possibly understand. It would mean revealing the full extent of her transformation, showcasing a power and a connection to the cosmos that would likely terrify them more than her original transgression ever had. The temptation to simply let them struggle was a cold, sharp stone in her heart. They had chosen fear over understanding, preservation over creation. Let them deal with the consequences of their own rigid world. This was not her problem anymore. She had a larger sky to watch over. But as she observed their growing panic, a different perspective emerged. This was not a moment for revenge or for proving a point. The instability in the forge was a symptom of a deeper sickness, a chasm between the old ways and a new reality that she herself had ushered in. The elders were not evil. They were simply lost, custodians of a fading map, trying to navigate a suddenly changed landscape. Their struggle was a microcosm of the very dissonance she was learning to correct in the cosmos, a failure of harmony. To ignore their plight would be to perpetuate the very isolation and fear that had caused the problem in the first place. It would mean the forge, this living entity she had bonded with, would remain a source of terror and conflict for her people. She saw a chance, not for confrontation, but for connection. This was an opportunity to build a bridge, to offer a hand across the generational divide, and show that the power they feared could be a source of guidance, not destruction. The personal stakes of this choice felt as profound as any cosmic battle. This was about healing a wound that was deeply personal, the ache of exile and misunderstanding that had been festering since she first touched the anvil. Success could mean reconciliation, the mending of a rift within her own soul as much as within her community. It offered the hope of integrating her new, vast identity with the roots of her old life, of no longer being a myth whispered in fear, but a known, if changed, daughter of the mountain. But failure carried its own unique sting. If her attempt to help was met with rejection, if her new nature was seen as an abomination or a threat, the wound would be ripped open anew, deeper and more painful than before. It would cement her eternal separation, turning her home into a place she could only ever observe from a distance, a permanent reminder of what she had lost. The risk of reopening that old pain was terrifying. With a resolve born not of defiance, but of a deep, compassionate certainty, Lyra made her decision. She would not descend upon them in a blaze of celestial glory. Instead, she would meet them on their own ground, in the heart of the chamber where it had all begun. Focusing her will, she drew upon the faint, silvery light of the sigil on her palm, the mark of her bond with the stars. She did not summon a torrent of power, but a whisper of it, enough to weave a subtle thread of energy back to the mountain. In the center of the forge chamber, where the air shimmered with the Elder's failed containment spells, a figure began to coalesce from motes of gentle light. It was an astral projection of herself, not a ghost or an illusion, but a focused manifestation of her consciousness. She appeared not as a towering goddess, but as she had been, yet unmistakably changed her form, shimmering with a soft, internal luminescence, her eyes holding the calm depth of the void. The projection solidified just as Master Orrin raised his hands for another fruitless incantation, and the sudden, silent appearance of their exiled apprentice in the very center of their crisis brought every elder to a stunned, disbelieving halt. The chamber fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the forge's erratic sputters. The elders stared, their incantations dying on their lips, at the luminous apparition of the apprentice they had condemned. But Lyra's astral form did not glare with accusation or radiate vengeful power. Instead, she offered a calm, small smile, her eyes holding a depth that seemed to contain whole galaxies. She ignored their shock and turned her attention to the restless anvil. "The forge is not a lock to be forced," she began, her voice not a shout, but a clear, carrying tone that resonated with the chamber's very stone. "It is a breath to be matched. You are trying to command a river to stop flowing. You must instead learn to channel it." She then began to guide them, not with complex commands, but with simple, profound corrections to their ancient rituals. "The third stanza of the binding hymn," she said gently to Elder Kalin, who was frantically chanting. "You emphasize the syllable of containment. Try instead the syllable of invitation. It is not about holding the power back, but about asking it to flow in harmony with your intent." The elder, his face a mask of skepticism, hesitated, but then altered his cadence. Instantly, the violent surge of energy he was battling softened into a manageable stream. To another, she suggested a minor adjustment in the placement of her hands on a focusing crystal, turning a gesture of suppression into one of reception. One by one, under her quiet direction, their frantic efforts transformed from a struggle against the forge into a delicate collaboration with it. The chaotic flares of light subsided, the deep hum smoothing into a steady, contented pulse. The forge was not defeated, it was placated, understood. In the newfound quiet, Master Orrin could only watch, his old heart pounding not with fear, but with a dawning, humiliating awe. He saw not a ghost, but a master at work. The authority with which she spoke did not come from a desire for dominance, but from an intimate knowledge that transcended every text in their library. She understood the forge's nature because she had become a part of it, and she asked the same of them. There was no trace of the rebellious youth he had chastised. In her place was a being whose every word was imbued with the quiet wisdom of the cosmos itself. The shame that washed over him was not for having punished her disobedience, but for having failed to see the potential that lay within it. He had been so focused on preserving the rules that he had blinded himself to the truth they were meant to serve. His rigid pride, which he had worn as a badge of office, now felt like a chain that had kept him imprisoned in a tiny room while she had ventured out to map the infinite. The true conflict in the chamber was no longer between the elders and the forge, but within the elders themselves, most acutely within Orrin. It was a battle between a lifetime of ingrained tradition and the undeniable evidence of a higher truth standing before them. Could their pride, the very foundation of their authority, withstand the revelation that their exiled apprentice had not only surpassed them, but had achieved a symbiosis with creation they had only ever theorized about? The tension was palpable, a silent struggle on each aged face. To accept her guidance was to admit their entire framework of knowledge was incomplete, that their fear had been a cage of their own making. It was a pill more bitter than any of them had ever expected to swallow. Lyra, sensing this internal turmoil, made her most powerful decision yet. She offered them a path through their shame without a single word of reproach. There was no, "I told you so," no recrimination for her exile. Her focus remained entirely on the forge, on sharing the knowledge they so desperately needed. By withholding any judgment, she gave them the space to arrive at their own realization. Her generosity was a mirror, reflecting their own rigidity back at them, and in that reflection, they could not help but see the pettiness of their former stance. She demonstrated that her journey had purified her of the need for vindication. Her only desire was to heal, to bridge the gap between the old ways and the new reality she represented. Her silence on the past spoke louder than any accusation ever could. The stakes of this quiet interaction could not have been higher for the future of the Star Forgers. This was not merely about stabilizing one rogue energy surge. It was a pivotal moment that would determine whether their ancient craft would continue as a secretive, fearful practice of preservation, or if it would evolve into something greater, an active, conscious partnership with the celestial order. Lyra was offering them the key to this evolution. If they could overcome their pride and accept her knowledge, they would not be diminished. They would be elevated, their role transformed from simple caretakers of a silent tool into apprentice guardians of a living cosmos. But if they rejected her out of wounded pride, they would seal their own fate, ensuring their knowledge would remain forever stagnant, and their connection to the true power of the heavens would be permanently severed. The Forge's calming hum was an invitation to a new age, and their response would echo for generations. As the last ripple of instability faded and the Forge settled into a deep, harmonious resonance it had not known for centuries, Lyra's astral form turned its gaze fully upon Master Orrin. The gentle light in her eyes held an immense compassion, but also a solemn gravity. "Master Orrin," she said, her voice soft yet carrying in weight that filled the chamber. "The view from the mountain peak is particularly clear tonight. The stars have much to tell us. Will you walk with me?" It was not a command, but an invitation, one that acknowledged his position while gently asserting her new role as a guide. It was a request to step away from the confines of the chamber, from the judging eyes of the other elders, and to speak under the vast, truthful sky where her transformation had begun. The thin, cold air at the mountain peak was a stark contrast to the warmth of the nebula Lyra had so recently left. Here, under the breathtaking clarity of the now brilliant stars, the world felt both immense and intimately small. Lyra's physical form stood beside Kalin, his crystalline presence casting soft, shifting patterns of light on the frost-tinged stone. They did not have to wait long. The sound of labored breathing and the careful scrape of a staff announced Master Orrin's arrival. He emerged from the winding path, his aged frame silhouetted against the star-dusted sky, and for a long moment he simply stood, his gaze moving from Lyra's peaceful face to the celestial guardian at her side, and then up to the heavens he had spent his life studying from a fearful distance. The silence that stretched between them was heavy with everything left unsaid. It was not the hostile silence of the forge chamber, but the profound, aching quiet that follows a great storm. Orrin's shoulders, usually squared with the weight of authority, were slumped. The defiance and fear that had armored him were gone, leaving behind a raw, weary honesty. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion he had long suppressed. "I looked at the stars," he began, his eyes fixed on the steady pulse of Serpentarius, "and I saw only rules. A grand design so perfect and so fragile that the smallest deviation would shatter it. I believed our highest calling was to preserve that design, to keep the sacred fire contained so it would never go out." He tore his gaze from the sky and looked directly at Lyra, and in his eyes she saw not the stern master, but a frightened old man. In my zeal to protect the flame, I forgot that fire, by its very nature, must be fed. It must be used. I confused caution for wisdom, and in doing so, I nearly allowed the very silence I feared to consume everything. This was the apology, not in a simple, "I was wrong," but in a confession that laid bare the philosophy that had guided his entire life, and the tragic flaw at its center. He admitted that their order had become so obsessed with preserving the tool that they had forgotten its purpose. The Valacirca Forge was not meant to be a museum piece. It was an instrument of adventure and sacrifice, a means to engage with the cosmos, not to hide from it. His rigidity had not been born of malice, but of a deep, generations-old fear, the fear of the responsibility and the cost that true creation demands. The emotional tension of the moment was a tangible force. For Lyra, this vulnerability from the man who had once been the ultimate authority in her life was more disarming than any celestial threat. It required a vulnerability in return. Lyra felt no triumph, no desire to list her sufferings or to make him feel the depth of his error. The journey through the cosmos had burned away any need for that kind of victory. She saw his confession for what it was, a painful, necessary shedding of an old skin. Her response was not an absolution she granted, but a truth she stated. "There is nothing to forgive, Master Orrin," she said, her voice carrying the calm resonance of the void. "You acted from the knowledge you had, from a love for this mountain and its legacy that is as deep as my own. Fear is a powerful teacher, but it is a poor guide. You taught me the rules, and that foundation allowed me to understand why they had to be broken." In her words, she offered him not just forgiveness, but a redefinition of their relationship. She was not his redeemed apprentice. She was his equal, and now his potential guide into a wider universe. It was then that she made the offer that would heal the central rift of their story. The sky does not need wardens who stand guard with locked gates, she explained, gesturing to the brilliant tapestry above. It needs partners. The celestial guardians, like Kalin, have watched over the great machinery for eons, but they are few, and the cosmos is vast. The star forgers have the craft, the hands to mend and to create. But you have been trying to read the music of the spheres with your eyes closed. She proposed a new covenant. She would act as a liaison, a bridge between the mortal knowledge of the mountain and the ancient wisdom of the Watchers. She would teach the star forgers to listen to the heavens, to understand the celestial clockwork, not as a static design to be preserved, but as a living, breathing entity to be tended. The stakes of this reconciliation were nothing less than the future of their entire tradition. By accepting her offer, Orrin would be ensuring that the knowledge of the Valacirca Forge would never again be lost to fear. It would be integrated, elevated, and passed down not as a forbidden secret, but as a sacred trust. The Star Forgers would transition from being isolated caretakers of a dangerous relic to becoming apprentice guardians in a cosmic partnership. This healed the wound at the heart of their world, turning Lyra's exile from a permanent schism into the catalyst for a renaissance. The fear that had festered in the mountain's heart was being replaced by the possibility of wonder. As they stood there, the agreement settling between them like a new constellation being named, Lyra felt a subtle, distant tremor in the fabric of her awareness. It was a faint, quickening pulse, a vibration of pure potential blooming in a nebula on the far side of the galaxy. A new star had just been born, and she felt its first, shy cry echo through her connection to the cosmos, a silent testament to the endless cycle of beginnings. The silence that followed their reconciliation was not empty, but full. It was a space where the old tensions could dissipate, replaced by a shared, quiet awe as they stood together under the sky they had both sworn to protect in their own ways. It was in this profound stillness that Lyra felt a subtle, yet unmistakable, tremor in the cosmic fabric. It was not a sound or a light, but a sensation, a quickening. Deep within a vibrant, swirling nebula on the far edge of a spiral arm, a pocket of gas and dust, compressed by gravity for eons, had reached its critical moment. A new star was being born. To her newly attuned senses, it felt like a single, clear note being sung into the great symphony for the very first time, a tiny, brilliant heartbeat joining the rhythm of the universe. This was not a call of distress, like the fading pulse of Serpentarius that had once called to her. This was a cry of arrival, an event of pure, natural creation that was part of the celestial clockwork's endless cycle. And Lyra understood instantly that her role was not to interfere, but to assist. With a focus that was now as natural to her as breathing, she extended her awareness towards the nascent star. She did not force her will upon it. That was the way of the old, fearful forger, trying to command the river. Instead, she offered a gentle guidance, like a steadying hand on the shoulder of a child, taking its first steps. She felt the star's raw, chaotic energy, the furious nuclear fires struggling to find equilibrium. With the lightest of touches, she helped nudge the swirling maelstrom of plasma, encouraging its spin to stabilize, its fierce light to find a constant, sustainable rhythm. She was not building the star. She was simply ensuring its path into existence was a smooth one, a midwife attending a cosmic birth. The act itself was one of pure, unadulterated joy. There was no conflict, no desperate race against time, no fear of a terrible cost. This was the fulfillment of her purpose in its most perfect form, not repairing what was broken, but welcoming what was new. It was a testament to her complete integration into her life as a watcher. She was no longer an outsider manipulating forces she barely understood. She was a harmonious part of the process itself, a conscious element of the universe's creative will. The stakes in this moment were not about survival, but about meaning. This simple, graceful act solidified her transformation, proving that her power was meant for nurturing, not just for salvaging. She was a guardian of life in all its stages, from its first spark to its final, gentle return to starlight. As the new star settled into its stable orbit, burning with a confident, youthful light, Lyra turned to Master Orrin. The wonder she felt was too immense to keep to herself. She saw the longing in his old eyes, the lifetime of observing the stars from a distance without ever truly feeling their pulse. Reaching out, she lightly touched his shoulder. She did not transfer power to him, but instead, she opened a tiny window in her own perception, sharing the echo of the sensation she had just experienced. For a single, breathtaking second, Orrin was not just a man looking at a point of light. He felt the tremendous, joyful pressure of the birth, the awesome release of energy, the profound rightness of a new sun taking its place in the galactic tapestry. It was a feeling beyond words, a glimpse into the vibrant, living reality of the cosmos he had only ever studied as a static map. A tear traced a path through the wrinkles on his cheek, not of sadness, but of overwhelming revelation. This shared experience was more than a personal moment. It was a symbol that echoed across the future of the Star Forgers. It represented the new era dawning for his people. No longer would they be isolated wardens, fearing the sky. Lyra's act demonstrated the potential for a partnership based on understanding and reverence, where mortal hands could learn to work in concert with the universe's own rhythms. The mountain's legacy was being reborn, not as a fortress of secrets, but as an observatory of connection. The silent agreement between them was that this wonder could and would be taught. The celestial clockwork had gained not just a new star, but a new generation of caretakers who would learn to listen to its music. As the last echo of the stellar birth faded from their shared awareness, Kalin, who had been a silent, approving observer, drifted closer. His crystalline form reflected the light of the new star, and his voice was a soft, melodic chime. "A new voice has joined the chorus," he said, his gaze shifting between Lyra and Orrin. "Every voice deserves a name. It is a tradition among watchers to name the ones we help guide into being. What shall we call this one, born from a moment of newfound understanding?" He paused, letting the question hang in the thin mountain air. Perhaps a name that speaks of beginnings after endings, a name like Anatos, the word meant ascent or return, a perfect embodiment of the second chance they had all been given. The name Anatos hung in the clear mountain air, not just as a word, but as a promise made solid. Lyra, Kalin, and Master Orrin stood together, their gazes fixed on the new point of light in the distant nebula. The act of naming was not a mere formality. It was an inscription, a ritual of profound significance. Lyra raised her hand, the sigil now glowing with the soft, steady light of the stars themselves, and with a gentle sweep of her fingers, she did not write in any visible language, but wove the name directly into the cosmic currents. The three of them felt it happen, a subtle but permanent shift in the fabric of reality, as if a new thread had been tied into the great tapestry. Anatos, the Star of Ascent, was now officially welcomed, its identity forever linked to the story of reconciliation, and second chances that had given it a name. This simple, collaborative act had consequences that reverberated far beyond the emotional moment. By inscribing the name together, a mortal elder, a celestial guardian, and a transformed watcher, they were performing a ceremony that formally recognized the Star Forger's renewed and elevated place in the universal order. No longer were they isolated caretakers of a dangerous secret, hiding from the cosmos they sought to preserve. They were now acknowledged partners, their craft and their voices granted a legitimacy by the heavens themselves. The forge on the mountain was no longer a locked vault of power. It was becoming an embassy, a point of contact where mortal hands could learn to work in conscious harmony with the celestial mechanics of creation. The ancient fear that had defined their order for generations was being replaced by a sense of belonging to something infinitely larger. There was no conflict in this moment, only a deep, cathartic release. The tension of Lyra's exile, the terror of the Nexus failing, the weight of sacrifice, all of it seemed to dissolve under the gentle light of the newly named star. For Orrin, it was the lifting of a burden he had carried his entire life, the fear of making a mistake so grand it would unravel creation. Now he saw that engagement, not isolation, was the true path. For Lyra, it was the quiet joy of seeing the broken pieces of her life, her home, her purpose, her relationships fitted back together into a picture more beautiful and complete than she could have ever imagined. The moment was a shared exhalation, a collective breath of relief and wonder after a long and harrowing storm. The decision to choose the name together was perhaps the most important part of the entire ceremony. It was not Lyra dictating terms from her new celestial height, nor was it Orrin clinging to an old, rigid tradition. It was a true collaboration, a melding of mortal wisdom and cosmic perspective. Kalin offered the suggestion, drawn from the ancient language of the Guardians. Lyra felt its rightness in her soul, and Orrin, with his deep knowledge of old texts, recognized its profound meaning and gave his solemn nod. This three-part agreement cemented the new alliance, proving that the partnership was not just theoretical. It was a practical, working relationship where each voice, each perspective, was valued and essential for the tasks ahead. In doing so, they set a powerful precedent for all the ages to come. The heavens, they demonstrated, would never again be carved by forgotten hands, working alone in the dark, their efforts unacknowledged and their sacrifices unknown. From this moment forward, the work of maintaining the cosmos would be a shared endeavor. The Star Forgers would bring their craft, their passion, and their mortal perspective. The Watchers would provide the vast, timeless knowledge and the connection to the cosmic whole. Together, they would ensure that the story of creation would be a continuous, collaborative narrative, not a series of forgotten chapters. The naming of Anatos was the first entry in a new cosmic record, one that would be written by many hands. As the last echoes of the ritual faded and a comfortable silence settled between the three figures on the peak, Lyra felt a subtle but unmistakable shift within her. It was a quiet tug, a sensation deep in her awareness that was entirely separate from the serene moment. It was the faintest whisper of discord, a single, strained note in the great symphony of the spheres, coming from a direction she had never before sensed. It was not a cry of emergency, not like the desperate stutter of the Nexus, but more like a faint call for help, a thread of instability in a distant spiral arm of the galaxy. The feeling was clear and unquestionable. Her time of learning, of reconciliation, of shared ceremony was over. Her first solo assignment as a full watcher was beginning. The quiet sense of accomplishment that had settled over the mountain peak was gently interrupted by a subtle shift in the cosmic currents, a sensation that resonated directly with the sigil on Lyra's palm. It was not an alarm, but a notification, a gentle, persistent tug at her awareness, like a single instrument in the grand orchestra, falling slightly out of tune. She turned her gaze inward, allowing her consciousness to follow the signal across the unimaginable distances, and the picture that formed in her mind was both clear and unsettling. In a distant galaxy, far beyond the familiar patterns of her home sky, one of the spiral arms was suffering. Stars there were not aging with the graceful slowness of cosmic time. They were decaying prematurely, their light fading like embers doused by an unseen chill. This was her summons, her first official assignment as a watcher, and it was a task she was to undertake entirely on her own. This mission marked a profound transition in her eternal duties. Every previous challenge, from her initial defiance to the salvation of the Nexus, had been faced with Kalin by her side, his ancient wisdom a constant guide and a steadying presence. Now she was being called to prove her mettle without that safety net. The celestial guardian remained on the peak, his luminous form a silent pillar of support, but he made no move to accompany her. This was by design. Her training was complete. The lessons in listening to the music of the spheres, the painful understanding of consequence, the delicate touch required for true guardianship, all of it had led to this moment of solo flight. The weight of that independence settled on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a solemn responsibility. She was no longer a student, but a fully fledged guardian, and the cosmos was now her parish. A natural tension arose, one entirely different from the life or death struggle she had known. This was the quiet, gnawing tension of self-doubt, the internal question of her own competence. Could she truly diagnose a problem of such scale without Kalin's eons of experience to interpret the signs? If she made a mistake, there would be no one to correct her course before the consequences spiraled. The vast, empty void between galaxies suddenly felt immense and isolating. This journey into the unknown was the ultimate test of the confidence she had built, a test to see if the wisdom she had absorbed was truly her own, or if it was a borrowed light that would flicker and die in the absence of its source. Lyra met this internal challenge not with bravado, but with a calm acceptance that felt like coming home. She looked from Master Orrin's face, etched with a new kind of respect, to Kalin's silent, trusting gaze, and she felt a deep certainty click into place. This was not a test she needed to pass for them. It was the true beginning of the work her soul had always been destined to perform. Embracing the mission was an affirmation of her own hard-won identity. She was Lyra, the Watcher, and it was time to go to work. The stakes, while less apocalyptic than the end of time, were deeply personal and professional. Her effectiveness as a guardian, her very fitness for this eternal role, would be defined by how she handled this first independent investigation. Success would mean she had truly internalized her purpose. Failure would not doom the universe, but it would cast a long shadow over her confidence and prove that she still relied on a guide. With a final warm glance at her two anchors, one to her past, one to her eternal present, she offered a simple nod. No grand speeches were needed. Turning from the mountain and its familiar sky, she faced the endless dark. Raising her hand, she willed a new path into being. From the sigil on her palm, a bridge of pure, soft light streamed forth, arcing away from the world and into the deep void, a luminous road leading towards a distant, ailing galaxy. Without a backward glance, she stepped onto its shimmering surface, and the light carried her away from all she had known, into the silent, star-dusted expanse of her boundless new duty. The bridge of light dissolved behind her, leaving Lyra suspended in the deep, velvet silence at the edge of the ailing galaxy. The transition from the familiar constellations of her home to this foreign spiral arm was jarring. Here, the vibrant symphony of the cosmos she had learned to hear was muted, replaced by a discordant, weary sigh. Instead of the bright, confident chords of healthy stars, she perceived a faint, rasping whisper, as if the very light was struggling to travel through the space between the suns. Following this whisper of decay deeper into the spiral arm, the source of the malaise soon became horrifyingly clear. It was not a predator, not a void-born parasite, nor a malfunction in the celestial clockwork. The enemy was the environment itself, a vast, nebulous cloud of interstellar dust, spanning distances greater than whole solar systems, drifted slowly through the region. But this was no ordinary cloud. It was contaminated, poisoned by a rare, crystalline mineral that radiated a faint, energy-draining frequency. Each mote of dust acted like a tiny sponge, passively soaking up the life, giving radiation from the stars it passed, leaving behind systems languishing in a premature twilight. The stars themselves weren't dying from old age. They were being slowly suffocated. This revelation fundamentally changed the nature of the challenge. There was no conscious antagonist to outwit, no central heart to restart. This was a pollution on a galactic scale, a slow-acting sickness in the ecosystem of space itself. A direct, forceful confrontation was not only impossible, it would be counterproductive. Trying to blast the cloud away would be like trying to disperse a fog bank with a bomb. The energy expended would likely only excite the mineral further, worsening the decay. The conflict Lyra faced was no longer about courage or power, but about immense scale and almost unimaginable patience. The cloud was so vast that cleansing it inch by inch would take millennia, and all the while, more stars would fade. She had to think not like a warrior, but like a gardener facing a blight that had infected an entire continent. The tension was one of sheer magnitude, a problem so large it threatened to overwhelm the very concept of a solution. Drawing upon the vast reservoir of the Titan's knowledge now woven into her being, Lyra assessed the problem with a calm that belied its enormity. The contaminated mineral had a specific resonant frequency, a unique vibrational signature that made it absorb energy. The solution, therefore, was not to attack it with more energy, but to change its nature. She needed to introduce a counter-frequency, a wave of energy so finely tuned it would not destroy the mineral, but gently encourage its crystalline structure to reconfigure, to become inert. It would be a cosmic antidote, a melody played to neutralize a poison. This was a task for the Valacirca Forge, but not as a blazing torch. She needed it to act as a subtle composer, conducting a symphony of cleansing that would ripple across light years. Her decision was one of profound wisdom, a testament to how far she had come from the apprentice who sought immediate, dramatic results. She would use her connection to the forge to create a wide area, cleansing pulse. This would not be a violent explosion of light, but a gentle, persistent wave of calibrated energy that would propagate through the dust cloud at the speed of light. It would be a slow, meticulous process. The pulse would need to be sustained for centuries, its resonant song constantly playing, slowly convincing each particle of mineral to release its hungry nature and become harmless dust. She was not fixing a break. She was administering a long-term, gentle medicine to a galaxy-sized patient. The work would be methodical, undramatic, and would continue long after her attention was needed elsewhere. The stakes of this decision were as vast as the cloud itself, but they were measured in a new currency, deep time. The health of every star system within that spiral arm and the potential for life on countless worlds within them hung in the balance. A misjudgment in the pulse's frequency could be disastrous. Too weak, and it would have no effect. A wasted effort against the endless hunger of the mineral. Too strong or slightly miscalibrated, and it might cause the crystalline structures to shatter violently, releasing all their stored energy at once in a catastrophic chain reaction that could sterilize entire systems. The responsibility required a perspective that spanned eons. She was making a choice whose full consequences would not be known for thousands of years. A legacy of intervention that would unfold far beyond the scope of any single mortal life, or even the memory of civilizations. This was the true weight of being a watcher, playing a role in timescales that dwarfed history itself. With a focus that demanded absolute precision, Lyra reached through the bond to the forge. She did not summon a torrent of power, but instead, she began to weave a pattern of incredible complexity, a resonant frequency as delicate and specific as a genetic code. She poured the blueprint of the antidote into the fabric of space itself, aiming it at the heart of the lethargic dust cloud. A soft, humming wave of silver-green energy began to emanate from her position, expanding outwards in a silent, ever-growing sphere. It was not a flashy spectacle, but a quiet, determined beginning, like the first drop of dye spreading through a vast ocean. She watched it go, knowing her active part in this story was now largely over. She had set the pulse in motion, a self-sustaining, gentle force that would now work its slow magic across the centuries, a testament to a kind of power that valued patience over spectacle and healing over conquest. Her work on the galactic malaise was complete, yet it was a completion that stretched into centuries. The cleansing pulse was now a self-sustaining song, a gentle vibration traveling through the poisoned dust cloud, patiently persuading each hungry mineral to sleep. There was no grand finale, no brilliant flash of light to mark a victory. The stars would continue to fade for generations before the healing wave even reached them, and their recovery would be a process slower than the growth of a forest. To simply leave felt irresponsible, like a doctor walking away from a patient in a long-term coma. The solution required a commitment beyond her own presence. And so, Lyra performed an act of profound stewardship. From the substance of her own will and a fragment of the forge's enduring consciousness, she wove a new being into existence. It was not a tool, but a companion for the void, a sentient crystal, clear as diamond, which she attuned to the specific frequency of the cleansing pulse. She placed it in a stable orbit at the edge of the ailing spiral arm, a silent, watchful eye. Its purpose was simple: to observe, to record the slow return of health to the stars, and to hold a vigil over the centuries-long healing. It would not interfere, it would only bear witness, a testament to the fact that the cosmos was cared for, even in its most remote and silent corners. This act was her final lesson in the true nature of eternity. The internal conflict she faced was not against an enemy, but against the very human desire for closure and recognition. She had been an apprentice who craved results, a hero who had saved the universe in a single, brilliant sacrifice. But now, her role demanded a different kind of courage, the courage to plant a tree whose shade she would never sit under. The satisfaction could not come from a grateful universe or the immediate sight of thriving stars. It had to be found in the quiet knowledge that she had set a process in motion for the benefit of generations of lives and civilizations yet to be born, beings who would never know her name. She had to learn to trust the work itself, to find fulfillment in the act of setting things right, regardless of who witnessed the outcome. This acceptance marked the completion of a journey that had begun with a trembling hand on a forbidden anvil. The impulsive girl who had sought to fix a single constellation through sheer force of will was gone. In her place stood a guardian who understood that some of the universe's most profound ailments required solutions measured in eons, not moments. Her maturation was now absolute. She had integrated the patience of the stars themselves into her spirit, understanding that watching and waiting could be as vital an act as creating or repairing. The stakes of this personal evolution were the final refinement of her purpose. Without this lesson, she would have remained an eternal firefighter, rushing from crisis to crisis, never understanding the deep, quiet work of prevention and long-term care. With the sentient crystal established as her proxy, its gentle awareness already beginning its multi-millennial watch, Lyra felt a sense of peace that was deeper than any fleeting triumph. She turned away from the ailing galaxy, its future now entrusted to time and her silent sentinel. But as she prepared to step onto a new bridge of light, to seek out the next whisper of discord in the great symphony, a faint and entirely unexpected sensation brushed against the edge of her consciousness. It was a signature she knew intimately, an energy pattern etched into her memory from the most desperate hour of her existence. It was the unique vibrational frequency of the temporal parasite, the void-born creature she had contained within the artificial singularity near the Nexus. But the signal was different now. It was no longer a frantic, hungry pulse. It had changed, evolved, complexified. It was not screaming to be freed. It was humming. A new and unsettling chapter in that story had begun without her, deep within the heart of its prison. The faint, familiar hum from the singularity was a quiet question mark in the back of Lyra's mind, a loose thread from the most dramatic chapter of her life that she had not yet dared to pull. With the cleansing pulse now steadily working its way through the distant galaxy, she turned her attention back to the scene of her greatest trial, the Nexus constellation. The journey was swift, a mere thought across the void, and there it was, the prison she had built. The miniature singularity hung in space, a perfect sphere of darkness encircled by a shimmering halo of trapped light, exactly as she had left it. But the creature inside was not as she remembered. The temporal parasite, once a formless, oily smear of pure consumption, had undergone a breathtaking transformation. It had not been consumed by the energy source, as she had half expected. Instead, it had woven itself into the very fabric of the Singularity's gravitational field. Its form was now geometric, crystalline, a complex lattice of shifting light and shadow that pulsed in a slow, rhythmic dance with the energy that sustained it. It was no longer a parasite, it was a symbiote. The frantic, hungry vibrations she recalled had been replaced by a low, harmonious hum, a contented melody that spoke of a stable, balanced existence. The prison had not become a tomb, but an incubator, and the monster had evolved into a unique, time-bending life form, something entirely new in the catalog of cosmic beings. This unforeseen development presented Lyra with a dilemma far more subtle than any she had faced before. There was no immediate threat, no crisis to avert. The conflict was purely ethical, a test of her philosophy as a guardian. Her old instincts, forged in the heat of battle, whispered a warning. This was an unknown variable, a creation born of desperation, whose long-term effects were impossible to predict. What if this stability was temporary? What if the creature's new form allowed it to eventually break free, stronger and more dangerous than before? The safest, most logical course of action was to intervene now, to carefully dismantle the singularity and disperse the entity before its potential could become a future catastrophe. It was the path of control, the elimination of ambiguity. But as she observed the serene, intricate dance within the singularity, a deeper wisdom, hard-won through sacrifice and understanding, rose to the surface. She thought of the butterfly constellation she had created for the Sentinel, an act of pure, hopeful creation. Was this not also a form of creation? The universe, in its infinite complexity, had a tendency to produce unexpected outcomes from chaotic circumstances. Life, in all its forms, was a testament to that principle. To destroy this new being simply because it was unknown, because it might pose a risk, felt like a betrayal of the very diversity she was sworn to protect. It was the mindset of the fearful elders, not of a watcher who had learned to listen to the music of the spheres. This creature was not evil, it was simply different, a miraculous anomaly born from a moment of crisis. The stakes of this quiet decision were not measured in the potential collapse of galaxies, but in the integrity of her own guardianship. Choosing to let the creature live was an acceptance of a fundamental cosmic truth, that control is an illusion. The universe was messy, unpredictable, and gloriously inventive. A true guardian had to be able to tolerate ambiguity and potential danger, to make space for the strange and the new, even when it emerged from the most unlikely of origins. Destroying the creature would be an act of fear, demonstrating that she valued a sterile, predictable order over the vibrant, unpredictable potential of life itself. Allowing it to exist, however, was a courageous embrace of cosmic diversity, a declaration that the unknown was not always an enemy to be vanquished, but sometimes a wonder to be observed. After a long, silent contemplation, Lyra made her choice. She would not intervene. She would let this strange, symbiotic life continue its silent evolution within its crystalline womb. It would remain under her watchful eye, a curious anomaly noted in the cosmic records, but it would be granted the chance to simply be. This decision felt like a final, subtle graduation, a sign that her wisdom had matured to a point where she could hold space for both absolute responsibility and open-minded wonder. She had moved from being a fixer of broken things to a curator of cosmic possibility. This hard-won acceptance of the unknown, this comfort with unresolved outcomes, was the perfect preparation for the responsibility that now called to her from the familiar slopes of the Valacirca mountain. It was one thing to tend to the stars, and another entirely to shape the mind that would one day hold them. Time, for the star forgers of the mountain, had settled back into a rhythm as steady as the constellations above. The fear that had once choked the great halls had been replaced by a cautious, burgeoning wonder. Under Master Orrin's new guidance, the ancient texts were studied not as rigid laws, but as a starting point for a greater conversation with the sky. It was in this atmosphere of quiet change that a small hand, driven by a curiosity that could no longer be contained by warnings alone, reached out in the deep silence of the forge chamber. A young apprentice, a girl with wide, bright eyes and a spirit that mirrored a forgotten recklessness, stood trembling before the Valacirca anvil. She had heard the whispers, the new, reverent tales of the apprentice who had become a watcher. And like an echo across the years, the same pull that had called to Lyra now called to her. Her fingers were just a breath away from the cold, cosmic ore when the sound of a footstep made her spin around, her heart leaping into her throat, expecting the stern face and disappointed gaze of Master Orrin. But the figure that stood in the chamber entrance was not the master. It was Lyra. She had not arrived in a flash of light or a dramatic projection. She had simply walked, her presence a natural part of the mountain's energy. She did not radiate anger or judgment. A gentle, knowing smile touched her lips as she looked at the frightened child, seeing not a transgression, but a reflection of her own beginning. The young apprentice flinched, waiting for the sharp reprimand, the lecture on forbidden power, the decree of punishment that would exile her from the very mysteries she longed to understand. But the words that came were soft, carrying the resonance of distant stars. "The anvil is not meant to be feared," Lyra said, her voice calm as a windless night. "But it must be approached with respect. Its voice is quiet. Before you touch it, you must first learn to listen." In that single moment, the entire legacy of the Star Forgers pivoted. The old cycle of prohibition and fear, which had so nearly led to disaster, was broken. Lyra did not scold the child for her curiosity. She validated it, redirecting its impulsive energy into a channel of mindful practice. The immediate consequence was the dissolution of the child's terror, replaced by a spark of awe and a dawning sense of immense possibility. The tension that filled the chamber was not one of disobedience, but of legacy itself. Lyra stood at the crossroads of the past and the future, holding the accumulated weight of her own painful journey, the branding, the sacrifice, the near dissolution of her soul. The critical question hanging in the air was whether she could transmute that hard-won wisdom into a lesson that would inspire rather than traumatize. Could she pass on the essential truths of sacrifice and responsibility without forcing this new, innocent spirit to walk through the same fire that had forged her? It was a test of her compassion and her skill as a teacher, a challenge as delicate as tuning a celestial gear. Her decision was immediate and instinctive, born from the understanding that fear had never been a successful teacher. Prohibition had only ever made the anvil more alluring. Instead, she chose the path of encouragement and wonder. She knelt, bringing herself to the child's eye level, and gently took the small, still trembling hand. She did not guide it to the anvil, not yet. Instead, she held it palm up towards the chamber's opening, where the night sky was a brilliant tapestry. "Close your eyes," she whispered. "Forget what you see. Listen for what you feel. The starlight is not just light, it is a song. Each star has its own note, its own vibration. Can you feel it? A faint humming, like a string being gently plucked from very, very far away." She was not teaching the child a technique from a scroll. She was introducing her to a fundamental truth, opening a door in the child's perception that the elders had kept locked for generations. The stakes of this gentle interaction were, in their own way, as profound as the reignition of the Nexus. The future of the Star Forgers, and by extension, the future guardianship of the sky, now rested on this fragile moment of connection. If Lyra failed, if she could not ignite a genuine, lasting wonder in this young heart, the old ways of fear might slowly creep back. The mountain could once again become a place of locked doors and silenced curiosity, ensuring that when the next great cosmic crisis arose, there would be no one with the wisdom or the courage to answer the call. But if she succeeded, if she could plant the seed of true understanding, that power was a partnership, not a possession, then she would be initiating an endless cycle of enlightened guardians. This child, and every child who came after, would grow up not fearing the cosmos, but feeling a part of its magnificent, humming chorus. The young apprentice, her face a mask of intense concentration, squeezed her eyes shut. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of her own nervous breathing. Then, a subtle shift. Her brow furrowed, not in frustration, but in discovery. A tiny gasp escaped her lips. I think I feel it," she whispered, her voice full of awe. "It's very quiet, like a bell made of glass." The child's eyes fluttered open, and they were no longer filled with fear or simple curiosity. They shone with the pure, unadulterated light of understanding. She had heard the music. In that luminous gaze, Lyra saw the past and the future converge. She saw her own youthful defiance transformed into guided wonder, her solitary path now branching into a road that would be walked by many. The cycle was not just continuing, it was healing, evolving. The hands that would one day carve the heavens would be guided by a legacy of encouragement, not fear. And as the child turned her rapt attention back to the star-filled sky, eager to hear more of its silent song, Lyra knew that the most important work, the work of nurturing the next spark of cosmic consciousness, had truly and beautifully begun anew. The quiet hum of the mountain had taken on a new melody, one of purpose and anticipation rather than fear. In the great hall, under the soft glow of crystals that now pulsed in time with the distant stars, Lyra stood before the assembled star forgers. Master Orrin was at her side, his presence a bridge between the old ways and the new. The decision they were about to announce felt as inevitable as the turning of the celestial gears, a natural culmination of all that had been sacrificed and learned. With a calm that resonated through the silent chamber, Lyra gave the new tradition its name and its rhythm, the Decadal Concord. Once every 10 years, the apprentice who showed not just the greatest skill with the forge, but the deepest empathy for the silent music of the spheres, would be chosen. That individual would be brought to the highest peak, not for a test of power, but for a meeting of minds with one of the Watchers, The consequences of this simple ceremony would ripple across centuries. It was a deliberate, structural solution to the poison of isolationism that had so nearly unraveled the heavens. No longer would the Star Forgers be left to interpret ancient texts in a vacuum, their knowledge growing stagnant and fearful without the context of the living cosmos. The decadal concord ensured a continuous, living flow of wisdom directly from the source. Each chosen apprentice would return to the mountain, not with a list of new rules, but with a first-hand understanding of the celestial clockwork, their perspective forever widened. They would become teachers among their people, carrying the torch of a larger reality and ensuring that the parochial fears of the past could never again take root. The mountain's library would remain vital, its shelves constantly updated with fresh insights from the edge of infinity, preventing its knowledge from becoming a relic and its people from becoming forgotten. In this moment, there was no clashing conflict, no desperate struggle against a ticking clock. The tension present was of a different, more profound nature, the quiet, hopeful tension of building something meant to last forever. It was the satisfaction of placing the final, crucial stone in an arch that would support generations yet unborn. The only friction was the gentle resistance of old habits being consciously set aside, replaced by a system built on trust and openness. The peace that settled over the gathering was not passive. It was an active, watchful peace, the kind that comes from knowing a vital safeguard has been put in place. This was the calm after the storm, not because the storm was forgotten, but because the foundations had been reinforced to withstand any future gale. This tradition was, without question, Lyra's most enduring contribution. It was a gift born from the totality of her experience, the pain of exile, the terror of the void, the weight of ultimate sacrifice, and the hard-won wisdom of guardianship. She was not giving them a weapon or a secret technique. She was giving them a connection. She was ensuring the relevance of her people by weaving them permanently into the fabric of cosmic stewardship. Their safety would no longer be dependent on hiding from power, but on understanding it. By formalizing this partnership, she was securing a future where the Star Forgers were not just safe in their mountain, but essential to the universe's well-being. Their craft would never again be irrelevant, because it would be perpetually informed by the needs of the cosmos it served. The stakes of this act were the highest imaginable, measured on a scale of eons. The long-term stability of the bond between the mortal and the celestial was now cemented. This was not a temporary alliance forged in a crisis. It was an institution designed to endure. The Watchers gained a network of grounded, skilled agents with a deep, generational knowledge of the Forge's practical magic. The Star Forgers gained access to the vast, timeless perspective needed to wield that magic wisely. It was a symbiosis that strengthened both, a guarantee that the heavens would never again be threatened by the ignorance of their caretakers. The celestial clockwork would henceforth be tended by hands that were both knowledgeable and guided, ensuring its rhythm would continue unbroken for ages to come. Standing on the peak later that night, the formalities complete, Lyra looked up at the beautifully carved heavens. The constellations burned with a steady, healthy light, each one a testament to the journey that had led her here. She felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling of a circle finally closing. The rebellious apprentice who had touched the anvil in secret was now the architect of a system that would make such rebellion unnecessary. Her personal journey, with all its pain and triumph, felt complete. Yet, as she watched a meteor streak across the velvet darkness, she knew this was not an ending. It was a seamless handoff. Her watch was eternal, and the universe was infinite. New stars would be born, new mysteries would arise, and her work would continue, but now with the quiet confidence that the mountain, and all it represented, was in good hands, forever linked to the stars it adored. The cycle was unbroken, and her purpose, though forever ongoing, was finally, deeply fulfilled. There is a place beyond the last swirling galaxy, a vantage point where the known universe unfolds like a map of living light. Here, at the very edge of creation, Lyra stands beside Kalin. They do not speak, for language is a clumsy tool for the symphony they are witnessing. Before them, galaxies spin in a slow, majestic dance, their spiral arms strewn with the diamond dust of a billion stars. In the profound darkness between these islands of light, new suns ignite in silent, brilliant flashes, the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of an expanding reality. This is their watch. It has no beginning, and it has no end. It simply is. The frantic journey of the apprentice, the desperate sacrifice at the Nexus, the joyful reconciliation on the mountain. All of it has led to this profound and peaceful stillness. Her personal saga, so full of sound and fury, has finally dissolved into the grand, silent narrative of the cosmos. She is no longer a character in a story. She has become a part of the setting, a permanent fixture in the landscape of eternity. The tension that once defined her existence has been replaced by a deep, resonant acceptance. There is no conflict here, no enemy to fight, no clock ticking down to doom. The only struggle is the beautiful, endless work of maintenance, a duty that feels less like a burden and more like the highest form of privilege. Each day, though the word day has lost all meaning in this timeless place, she consciously reaffirms the choice she made on the mountain peak. It is not a difficult reaffirmation to witness a nebula condense into a solar system, to feel the first faint vibrations of life stirring on a distant world, to gently guide a rogue comet away from a fledgling civilization. These are not chores. They are moments of pure, unadulterated joy. The infinite tapestry of creation is constantly weaving new patterns, and she has been granted a front row seat for the entire, breathtaking performance. The stakes of this eternal vigil are, paradoxically, both unimaginably high and beautifully simple. They are the continued existence of beauty itself, the preservation of order against the natural, entropic pull of chaos. It is the responsibility for every sunset that paints an alien sky, for every child on every world who looks up at the stars with wonder, for the very possibility of future stories yet to be told. This is the weight she carries, but it is a weight she bears gladly, for it is the weight of meaning. A single misstep, a moment of inattention spanning a millennium, could allow a ripple of discord to spread, unraveling a thread in the tapestry. But this awareness does not bring anxiety, it brings focus. It is the quiet understanding that her presence, her attention, is a fundamental force for good, as essential to the cosmic balance as gravity or light. In the vast, quiet stretches between tasks, when the universe seems to be humming along in perfect, self-sustaining harmony, Lyra's thoughts sometimes drift not to the future, but to the past. She turns her awareness inward, towards a single, familiar point of light in the sea of galaxies, the Valacirca mountain. She does not descend with ceremony or make her presence known. Instead, she becomes a silent observer, a gentle breath on the wind. She watches the new generations of star forgers, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the anvil. They now approach not with terror, but with reverent curiosity. She sees the chosen apprentice of the decade, standing on the peak with a watcher, their eyes wide as the music of the spheres is revealed to them. In these quiet moments, she is not a distant goddess or a fearsome legend. She is a guardian, watching over the heirs to her legacy, ensuring that the hands that carve the heavens will never again be forgotten, and that the story of creation will always have a willing and wonder-filled scribe. And so it came to this, not with a climactic clash of swords or a final, desperate incantation, but with a quiet, absolute decision made in the profound silence between heartbeats. The parasite was contained, the Nexus was free, but its great heart was dying, its pulse a faint, faltering whisper against the infinite dark. Lyra, her body, a hollow vessel held together by the thinnest thread of her bond with the forge, understood the final, unspoken requirement. The Pulsar needed a spark, a surge of pure, life-giving energy on a scale that dwarfed any act of creation she had yet attempted, and she was the only conduit. To channel that much power would mean completing a circuit with her own soul, spending the very last ember of her mortal life to reignite the sun that powered time itself. This was the true culmination of her entire journey, the point where every lesson, every sacrifice converged. The defiant apprentice who had craved recognition, the reckless forger who had wielded power like a weapon, the wise student who had learned the delicate art of listening. All those versions of herself were refined away in this single, clarifying moment. There was no enemy left to fight, no authority to defy. The only opponent was the final, natural limit of her own existence, and she chose not to fight it, but to embrace it as the ultimate expression of her purpose. The transformation was complete. She was no longer a girl trying to prove her worth to the world. She was a guardian, accepting that her worth was measured by what she was willing to give back to it. With a calm that felt like coming home, she turned to Kalin. Her voice, when it came, was not a tremor of fear, but a steady transfer of essential knowledge. She gave him quiet instructions on the rhythms of the forge, on how to communicate with its ancient consciousness after she was gone. She spoke of the new tradition that must be born, of the need to guide the next generation. These were not the words of someone facing an end, but of someone ensuring a beginning. She was entrusting the future, the entire, beautiful, ongoing story of the cosmos, to her friend. Her final act was not one of taking, but of giving away everything she had left to give. Then, she turned her focus inward, to the deep, symbiotic bond she shared with the Valacirca Forge. She did not command its power. She opened herself to it completely, an invitation for the ancient will to flow through her one last time. The keystone in her hand blazed, no longer a tool, but a lens focusing the entire might of a cosmic entity. And the energy came. It was not a stream, but the ocean itself, a tidal wave of primordial light that had ignited the first dawn of creation. This was the Forge's true purpose, and she was its perfect vessel. The sensation was beyond pain or pleasure. It was an unraveling and a reweaving of her very being. She felt her individuality, the unique collection of memories and desires that was Lyra. begin to dissolve, not into nothingness, but into the magnificent, boundless light she was channeling. Together, she and the Forge directed this colossal surge into the Pulsar's dying core. It was a needle of pure life, stitching the star's fractured heart back together. Inside the massive star, the faltering nuclear fires were drowned and then reborn, fused into a new, stable, and fiercely burning reality. The process was a cosmic defibrillation, a shock to a system on the very brink of eternal silence. As the Pulsar's core reignited, it flared into a beacon of pure, white-hot radiance. Its light washed over the entire Nexus constellation, and one by one, the other 6 Pulsars synced to this new, powerful rhythm, their 7 hearts beating as one in a perfect, harmonious cadence that echoed through the void. Across countless galaxies, the temporal ripples smoothed out, and time itself took a deep, steadying breath. Lyra held on, her consciousness a fading point of awareness in the brilliant torrent, until she felt the last celestial gear click into place with a certainty that resonated through all of existence. The job was done. Only then did she allow her grasp to loosen. The brilliant light surrounding her winked out, the connection severed, and in that final, quiet moment, there was no fear, no regret. There was only a profound and peaceful satisfaction, the quiet victory of a spark that had chosen to spend itself so that an infinite number of other sparks could continue to shine. Her greatest act of power was her ultimate act of surrender, proving that the will to nurture creation is a force more enduring than any star. And so, the great celestial clock, its mainspring healed by a selfless heart, ticks on through the eons. The silence that once crept like a frost across the constellations has been banished, replaced by a vibrant, humming harmony that resonates through the very fabric of space. Down on the Valacirca mountain, the air itself feels different, charged not with fearful secrecy, but with a sense of profound connection. The forges still glow, but now the apprentices who gather around them learn from texts that have been rewritten. Alongside the ancient diagrams of stellar alignment and energy channels, they now find a new chapter, a tale not of gods or titans, but of one of their own. They read of Lyra, the apprentice who dared to listen to a dying star, and in doing so, became a permanent part of the sky's own legend. Her story is not told as a warning against disobedience, but as an inspiration for compassionate courage, a lesson that the greatest power is found not in control, but in the willingness to serve a purpose greater than oneself. High above, woven into the light of the very stars she saved, Lyra's watch is eternal. She is a silent guardian, a watcher in truth. Her presence is no longer a physical form walking among mortals, but a subtle, comforting constant in the cosmos. To those who know how to listen, it can be felt in the steady, reliable pulse of a distant pulsar, or in the gentle gravitational nudge that guides a comet safely past a fledgling world. When a young star forger on the mountain peak, their heart full of doubt, looks up at the night and feels a sudden, inexplicable sense of peace and direction, that is Lyra's legacy. It is a gentle guidance offered not through words, but through a shared connection to the infinite tapestry she helped to mend. She is the promise that no one who reaches out to the heavens with a pure intent is ever truly alone. The myth we began with, the idea of the heavens being carved by forgotten hands, has been transformed. Those hands are not forgotten because they were never meant to work in isolation. Lyra's journey taught that the creation, and maintenance of the universe is a collaborative dance between the mortal and the cosmic, between the courage to act and the wisdom to sacrifice. The Star Forgers of the Mountain, now partners in this eternal work, ensure that the knowledge is passed down, that the hands that tend the stars are always remembered, always honored. The story of creation, therefore, does not end. It is a continuous, unfolding narrative, with new chapters being written every time a curious apprentice feels the first tremor of starlight in their soul, and every time a watcher gently steers the course of a newborn sun. It is a story that belongs to everyone who has ever looked up at the night sky and felt a sense of wonder, a silent promise that our own small stories are part of something magnificently vast.